something, where we came from, where we're going. But we can also all be friends, and I hope we're all going to learn something here tonight. My name is Dave Mulligan. I'm the moderator, which means I have to be moderate. Tough for me sometimes. But I'm going to do my best. I may jump in and play devil's advocate at times, but if I do, I promise, in the interest of equality, I'll alternate by playing God's advocate as well. Now let's go through the lineup here. First of all, we want to thank the Secular Student Alliance. Let's give them a hand. Our good friends here at the University of Nevada, for giving us this lovely space. Thank you to the university. And then Church of Christ at Green White Stars. Thank you. I know a lot of people from the church, friends of the church came all the way. A couple of groups, they drove all the way from Las Vegas. So let's clap for them as well, because that's a long way to go. I'm just quickly going to go through the format of what we're doing here tonight, what you can expect in this fascinating debate. First, we're going to start with science, the evidence of evolution by Ben Drum, and I'll tell you all about it in a minute. That's going to be about 20 minutes. Then we're going to hear from Casey Head, evidence of creation. That's also going to be about 20 minutes.
Richard, does that
camera? Then they're each going to have about 15 minutes as a rebuttal period to respond to what they heard from their opponents. Not that they're opponents. Yeah, they're opponents. Let's face it. They're going to battle it out. Now, after that, we're going to have a rebuttal presentation. Those are going to be 5 minutes for both of them. And then this is going to be fun. We're going to have a cross-examination where we're going to sit here at the table. I'll be in the middle, separated in case things get a little hot. And they're going to pose the question to their opponent again, who will then have 2 minutes to respond. Then we're going to have closing remarks from both, and they're going to be approximately 5 minutes. These are all approximate numbers. And then we're going to have audience Q&A. So you're all going to have plenty of time. So hold on to your comments. We don't want to hear too much behind one person or the other. We'll keep it till the end. And you'll have plenty of time. And when you ask your questions, we'll bring you down here. We'll have 2 lines, one for evolution and one for creationism. Oh, good point. You could have just texted me. You said, turn your phones off. See, that's why I said you could have texted me. I was trying to be clever. All right, now let's keep the line. In fact, I want everybody here to say, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. One more time, a little louder. Come on. That's right. There's a lot of love in this room, and there's going to be a little friction in some of the things that we talk about, but really, we're all in search of the same kind of things. Answers, but we're going to respect the other side, and maybe we can learn a little bit. I think some of us have a lot of preconceived notions, feelings about this subject and others. But let's open our minds, try to learn a little bit, have some fun. And with that said, I would like to introduce our players this evening. Both very impressive men. In this corner, for evolution, Dr. Bernard Drum. Now, Dr. Drum is a professional researcher for the Department of Physiology and Cell Biology at the University of Nevada in Reno, a lifetime advocate of science and critical thinking. Dr. Drum was co-awarded his PhD in physiology from the Dundalk Institute of Technology and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, one of my favorite places to go. Dr. Drum has also undergraduate degrees in biopharmaceutical science and applied bioscience. Dr. Drum's current research involves examining the role of calcium signaling relating to disorders of the gastrointestinal tract, of course, overactive bladder, and cerebral artery hypertension. Dr. Drum's work has been published in several peer-reviewed scientific journals, including Nature Reviews Urology, Cell Calcium, Journal of Urology, and Physiological Reports. He has presented work to almost 24 international scientific meetings and societies. As well as his research work, Dr. Drum also delivers lectures to graduate students at UNR on neuroeffector pharmacology, tutors international exchange students at UNR School of Medicine. Oh gosh. He serves as the outreach coordinator for the Secular Student Alliance, while we're here tonight, here at UNR, and is a contributor in the Faith Forum column of the Reno Gazette-Journal, representing the SSA. Kind of a flimsy resume, wouldn't you say? Now, I did a little research and found out that that's not even his real name. He was born Bernard Bongo, but he changed it to Drum so people would take it more seriously. That's not true. Now, for the creationism side, Mr. Casey Head. Casey is the current evangelist for the Queenway Church of Christ in Sparks, Nevada, just up the street from me. Previously, Mr. Head served as the evangelist for the Zoe. Sorry about that. Church of Christ in Reedyville, Kentucky. Mr. Head produces a regular webcast, Bible Answers, dedicated to providing simple, coherent answers to frequently asked Bible questions. Mr. Head also coordinates and implements Bible study classes at the Queenway Church of Christ in Sparks, taking place on Wednesdays and Sundays. Mr. Head is the founder and moderator of a Facebook religious discussion group, Apologetics Anonymous. I love that. Mr. Head is the author of several spiritually focused ebooks, including Book 1 of Psalms, Eli's Search for Truth, The Undivided New Testament, and The Age of the Earth, from a biblical perspective. Mr. Head is also a contributor for the Secular Student Alliance, again while we're here, at the University of Nevada, where he provides a Christian perspective at the SSA discussion group events. Mr. Head is also the author of the Silver Falls series, a collection of fiction-based novels for young adults. Now, I had a rumor that Mr. Head also changed his name. It used to be Mr. Foot, but he changed it to Head so he could feel closer to God. All right, with that, I think we should get started. What do you think? You don't want to hear me long. Let's get started. Dr. Bernard Drum. You can still call him Dr. Barker every now.
Thanks very much, Dave, for the fabulous introduction for myself and Casey. Thanks very much for participating tonight. Excuse me while I get my laser pointer. Can everybody hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
If the mic gets too far away from my mouth, shout at me so I know I'm doing something wrong. So, my name is Bernard Drum. I'm representing the pro-evolution side to tonight's debate. And I want to start off very, very simply by reading my title. Very gradual change we can believe in. Why evolution works as a scientific theory. And I think it's the subtitle that we're going to find is the most important part of this. Tonight we're talking about science, scientific theories and laws. What does it mean to be scientific? We're not really talking about if evolution is true, are we? We're talking about if it's scientific. Creationism, we're not talking about if it's true. We're talking about if there is scientific evidence for it. And that's important to bear in mind. So before we can really talk about these two things and which is more scientific, we need to really set in stone what science is and how we call something scientific. So I'm going to introduce the talk by talking first of all about the scientific method. You may have heard about this, but the scientific method is what we scientists use to investigate the natural world. Scientific knowledge is by definition derived from the scientific method. You can't be called scientific unless you're from the scientific method. What we have here is a very simple diagram showing you all how the scientific method works. We start off by making very simple observations. In order to explain those observations, we develop a hypothesis. A very important step is this third part here, predictions. In order to test our hypothesis, to find out if it's true, we predict things about it. If X is true, we predict that Y will happen. And we test those predictions with scientific experimentation. Depending on the results of those experiments, if our predictions stay or if they fall, our hypothesis is either supported or it's rejected, and we rework it and we go back to the drawing board. A very important part of the scientific method is the process of peer review. Some of you may know about this, some may not, so I'll briefly go over it. A scientist also works as an author, and they write up their data of their experiments in the form of an article, and they submit it to a scientific journal. And what happens in a scientific journal is that the article is sent to some of the top experts in the field, top scientists who are able to critically read the data And in doing this, they're able to evaluate the methodology, the research. They're really checking to make sure that the article has adhered to the scientific method that I've just explained. It acts as a filter to weed out bad science. Peer review assures that articles that are published in critical scientific journals have at least met the bare minimum of the scientific method. So I hope you're gathering at this point that at the core of the scientific method is testable predictions. And joined in with that, scientific theories and laws must be falsifiable in order to be considered valid. And I just want to make a quick note about theories and laws, because there may be some confusion about what a scientific theory actually is. In common everyday language, when we're speaking to ourselves, for example, the word theory has a slightly different meaning than it does to a scientist. The word theory is really just forming a hypothesis without any real evidence or observation. But a scientific theory has so much more weight attached to it. It means so much more. In science, when we say something is a theory, that means that is a statement which adequately explains a large body of facts and has been supported by firm, repeatable evidence and has predictive power. Again, predictions at the heart of it all. If hypothesis is true, we will find X. But does evolution fall into that criteria? Does it follow the scientific method? Does it even deserve the name of a scientific theory? Well, let's talk about what evolution is first of all. Very briefly to start off, evolution is the gradual change of a biological organism's inherited characteristics over successive generations. I want you all to take a moment to think about artificial breeding, particularly in dogs, something we're probably all familiar with. Artificial breeding actually tells us a lot about evolution, because it allows us to test the prediction that a selection process can bring about evolutionary change. Just think about all the different subspecies of dogs that we have that have even emerged in our own lifetimes. In the natural world, we don't breed organisms. Nature does it. And there is no artificial breeder. In nature, the process which chooses which characteristics get passed on in subsequent generations is a process known as natural selection. And just so you know, when I say traits, I'm really talking about genes, which are the molecular basis for our inherited characteristics. But in natural selection, this allows characteristics, or genes, which are beneficial to the organism, that is, to make it stay alive for longer and reproduce, to be genetically inherited by subsequent generations. And there are a couple of criteria we need in order for natural selection to happen. First of all, there must be variations in the gene pool. And the gene pool is just the set of genes in a certain population. Variety must be hereditary, and we know that they are. We know that our genes are inherited. We look the way we do because of the genes we inherit from our parents. Certain variants have to lead to more reproduction than others, and that's a very important point. And these variants get naturally selected to be preserved in the gene pool. And sufficient changes in these variants can eventually lead, over time, to new species. And I want to take a minute or two just to talk to you about species. There might be some confusion. How do we scientifically define what a species is? So let's talk about it. So in science, we generally refer to a species as a population of organisms that are capable of sharing genetic information that is reproducing and that can create fertile offspring. And when this happens, when we get divergence of species, a new species being made, we call that speciation. So let's define that very briefly. So in nature, populations of a species can become genetically isolated from one another, and they don't share genetic information. They don't reproduce anymore. They don't share their genes. Because they're isolated, they can undergo very different selection pressures, leading to changes in their inherited characteristics, again, genes. Given enough time, these once identical species can become genetically isolated enough that we say they are different species altogether. They can no longer share their genetic information. And when this happens, it gives rise to new species and allows for biodiversity to occur. So summarizing what we've all learned so far, what we call evolution is changes in the inherited characteristics or genes over time of an organism. It's driven by random genetic mutations and the non-random power of natural selection. This leads to speciation and explains the range of biodiversity of life on Earth. I know you're all thinking this is all really cool. It is. But in science, we can't just say nice things and have nothing to back them up with. We need the evidence. So is there evidence for what I'm saying? Do we have evidence for evolution? Let's remember that at the start of this talk, I outlined that one of the most important aspects of scientific theories is their predictive power. What can you predict specifically with them? These predictions must be specific, testable, repeatable in order to be valid and useful in science. They must also be capable of being false upon finding certain specific results. So let's look at some predictions in regards to evolution and see what we find. So if the theory of evolution is valid, we can predict certain things about the fossil record. We can predict that in the fossil record we should see a certain pattern in undisturbed rock layers or rock strata. We can predict that we should find simple fossils, or less complex and deeper or older rock layers, and more complex as we move up into the younger rock layers. And when scientists look in the fossil record, that is exactly what they find. This is a very simple diagram showing undisturbed rock layers with fossils inside them, with the oldest here at the bottom going to younger here at the top. And you'll notice, now of course this is a diagrammatic representation, but in reality this is what we find. Simple fossils are found in the deeper or older rock layers, and they gradually become more complex as we get younger. Now we didn't have to find it like this. If, for example, we found the more complex fossils mixed in with the younger ones in undisturbed rock layers, the theory of evolution, their prediction would not have really been fulfilled, would it? But that's not what we find. We can make further predictions in the fossil record. If evolution is valid, we can predict that fossils could be more similar to each other in adjacent rock layers, because evolution happens very gradually. And when, again, we look in the fossil record, that's exactly what we find. If we look at this layer of fossils, you'll notice that they are most similar to the fossils below it and above it. Again, we didn't have to find them like this. If we found the fossils all mixed together, this prediction would have failed. But that's not what we found. Another important piece of evidence from the fossil record based on predictions is, if the theory of evolution is valid, we can predict that mammals and other kinds of organisms should appear at a certain time period in the fossil record, but never before. We should never find dinosaurs mixed in with the aquatic life in the Cambrian period 500 million years ago. That's a prediction we can make. And when we look at the fossil record, that's exactly what we find. So here is the very simplest early life forms up to today. And what we find, for example, with mammals, is that they appear at a certain time period and never before. We find dinosaurs at a certain time period, never before. Humans at a certain time and never before. It didn't have to be like that. If, for example, we did find a dinosaur mixed in with the earliest fossil records, this theory would have fallen apart. The most famous example of this is this, the Precambrian rabbit. Yes. A rabbit is a modern day organism. We know it can fossilize, but we've never found it in the fossil record of the Cambrian area 500 million years ago. If we found something like this, evolution would be in serious trouble. But in the entire fossil record, there's not one example showing anything like this. Let's talk about transitional fossils. If the theory of evolution is valid, we can predict that at certain time points in the fossil record, there should be fossils that have features indicative of organisms between certain animal groups. An easy way to think about this would be before fish are found in the fossil record or after, but before mammals. We should find a fossil maybe that has features of both. And scientists have found such examples. On the left here is a guy called Tiktaalik, a wonderful example of a transitional fossil. Just like a fish, Tiktaalik had gills, he had scales, fins. But like a tetrapod, that is an animal that walks on all fours on the land, he had rib bones and lungs. Another great example is Archaeopteryx, transitional fossil between reptiles and birds. Like reptiles, Archaeopteryx had jaws, sharp teeth. It had fingers with claws and a bony tail. But like modern birds, it had wings and feathers, and a wishbone, something that's really only found today in modern birds. Perfect transitional forms. We didn't have to find these, especially seeing how fossilization is such a rare event, but we did. Let's move away from the fossil record now. Let's get into a bit of molecular biology. So if the theory of evolution is valid, one predicts that if we look at the genetic codes of different organisms and we measure how related they are to one another, they should form some kind of a family tree showing common ancestry to one another. Moreover, it would be predicted that all organisms that come from a common ancestor should share the same genetic code. And that's exactly what we find when we use molecular biology techniques. If you look at the genetic code of all life on Earth, it all has the same alphabet. Exactly what we would predict if there were common ancestors involved. And when we measure how related our genetic codes are with other organisms, they form this kind of family tree. This is us up here, on the branch of mammals. And what's really cool about this is that you do get the exact same pattern when you measure how related fossils are. It looks exactly the same. You measure how related a human fossil is to other apes, other reptiles, mammals, and this lines up exactly with what we find in molecular biology too. We can also talk about embryology, the study of human embryos and other organisms in their embryonic stage, when they're in the womb or in the egg. So we can predict that if evolutionary theory is valid, that groups of animals that share some kind of common ancestry should share the same features at early development, suggesting some kind of evolutionary relationship. And when we look at the embryos of different organisms, that's exactly what we find. On the left is a fish embryo, and on the extreme right, embryo of a human being. You'll notice they're quite similar, aren't they? At very early stages, human embryos look a lot like fish. We even have these structures, which are not true gills, they're actually called pharyngeal pouches. In fish, they develop into gills, whereas in humans, it turns into our vascular and circulatory system. But the common ancestry structures are plain to see. More than that, as a human embryo develops, it starts as looking like a fish, then an amphibian and a reptile, and then eventually a mammal or a bird, until finally it looks like a human.
5 minutes, Dr. Bongo. 5 minutes, please continue.
We didn't have to find this, but the fact that we do, it shows common ancestry and evolutionary relationships. Another strong evidence for evolution is geographical distribution of animals. Why animals are found in certain places, nowhere else. The most famous example is why we only find marsupials, kangaroos and the such, in Australia. The American opossum is a notable exception to that. But the curious thing is that the world's oldest marsupial fossils are found in Patagonia, in South America. So how does this make sense? Well, paleontologists and evolution biologists predicted that at one time, the land masses were joined. And the marsupials migrated from South America, where we get our oldest fossils for them, across Antarctica and into Australia. And they predicted that if this were true, we should find marsupial fossils in Antarctica. And 30 years after this prediction was made, that's exactly what they found. Marsupial fossils in Antarctica. This kind of evidence doesn't make any sense except in the light of evolutionary theory. Other things that don't make sense except in the light of evolution are vestigial organs. We can predict that should have vestigial or leftover structures, characteristics from our common ancestors. It's important to note that doesn't mean that they're useless, merely they no longer perform the function that they originally evolved for. And we find lots of examples of that. Even in ourselves, we have a coccyx or a bony tail. Have you ever noticed in the corner of your eye, you have a little membrane? You ever see a crocodile blink on TV or at the zoo and a membrane passes over? It's called a nictitating membrane, and we have that. It's a vestigial remnant of our reptilian common ancestors. This is a blind mole rat. Lives in complete darkness, can't see a thing, but has vestigial eyes. Whales live entirely in the water, but they have anatomical structures, vestigial remnants of a time when they had hips and legs. This kind of evidence doesn't make any sense except in the light of evolutionary theory. Similar to the idea of inactive genes, sometimes called junk DNA, but strictly speaking, they're just inactive genes. Why is this evidence for evolution? Well, think about it. Birds have genes for teeth, a remnant from their vestigial common ancestors. Human beings, for example, and primates have dead or inactive genes for making vitamin C, but in all other mammals, it's active. Why are these inactive genes there? It makes no sense except in the light of common ancestors and gradual evolution from them. Another really cool one is that humans have dead genes for making egg yolk, a vestigial remnant from our reptilian ancestors. This evidence makes no sense except in the light of evolutionary theory.
2 minutes, Doctor.
I hope you've realized by now that disproving evolution is actually a very, very easy thing to do. At each step tonight, I've shown you at each piece of evidence the way that it could have been falsified. If we found this, or if we found this, or if we didn't find this. However, to date, no evidence at all has been presented to disprove evolution based on the scientific method that I have described for you this evening. Is there any controversy about this in the scientific community? No, there isn't. In the scientific community, with those who adhere to the scientific method, it really is beyond reasonable doubt that evolution by natural selection explains the biodiversity and common ancestry of life on Earth. So if we're asking ourselves, does evolution have the scientific evidence to be justified, to be called a scientific theory, we would have to say that it absolutely does. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Fine presentation. I know you all have lots to say, probably some questions, but just hold on to them. Casey Head is now going to have 20 minutes to state the case for creationism. Casey, come on up. Let's hear it more.
Good evening. It's good to see all of you here tonight. I'm glad you've come out. I'm overwhelmed by the turnout. I knew we had quite a few, and standing room only indeed. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for your interest in what I believe to be a very, very important issue. There's a lot I want to say by way of introduction, but I have more to say in my speech and not a whole lot of time to say it. So if you don't care, I am going to jump right in. My obligation tonight is to affirm that there is more scientific evidence for creation than there is for evolution. And I want to begin by defining what creation is. I think that I saw a definition recently that didn't quite jive with the way I understand it, so let's get on the same page. Creation is defined as the belief that the universe and living organisms originate from specific acts of divine creation, as in the biblical account, rather than by natural processes such as evolution. And so this is what I'm affirming tonight. I'm affirming that this is more scientific, more scientifically viable than the traditional evolutionary position has defined it. And I'm going to be honest with you. It's very awkward for me to stand before you tonight defending creation from exclusively a scientific perspective. Because, like with many Christians, I'm sure, and many theists for that matter, we don't believe in God, we don't believe in creation because we follow the scientific method to get there. We believe in creation because of personal experience and intuition, and most of all, the Bible. Having said that, I do believe that there is scientific evidence for it, as we'll see in just a few minutes. Francis Collins, a believer, by the way, and the head of the very famous Human Genome Project, said in his book, The Language of God, great book, by the way, I'd recommend it. He says, it also became clear to me that science, despite its unquestioned powers in unraveling the mysteries of the natural world, would get me no further in resolving the question of God. If God exists, then he must be outside the natural world, and therefore the tools of science are not the right ones to learn about him. Now, I agree with Mr. Collins, but I want to make very clear that he's not saying that there's no scientific evidence for God, that we can't look at the natural world and draw the conclusion that there is a God. And so we need to understand that. But the point is that God has made the world, he's made a physical world to operate according to physical laws. All right, so we're not going to look at the world and see God's signature on something. We're not going to see God walking over the earth with a tool belt and a watering can. That's not how God operates. The Bible's very clear about this. But the question really is this. Is the natural world, is the data we observe best understood and best explained in light of the creation model? Because I'm a Christian, I'm primarily interested in the biblical creation model. Now, I've been to professional scientists. I make no bones about it. I am not. I'll hesitate to make a confession to you. I'll save that for the end if I feel so bold. But I would like to follow the scientific method to some extent. And I'd like to talk about predictability and falsification. Based on the biblical creation model, what predictions can we make about organic life? And can these predictions be tested, and can they be falsified? If so, the question is how? And due to time constraints, and for the sake of clarity, I'm going to focus this evening on the creation of organic life in Genesis 1, and based on this passage, which I'll cite throughout my affirmative speech, there are three predictions that I believe we can make about organic life. Number one, life was created fully formed. Number two, God made distinct kinds of organisms. And number three, man is unique in God's creation. Let's begin this evening with prediction number one, that life was created fully formed. According to the biblical creation model, God created all organic life on days 5 and 6 of the creation week. We're told here that God didn't create simple molecules or unicellular organisms that then later evolved into more complex life forms, but rather that God created these creatures fully formed, and mankind is a case in point. In Genesis 2, verse 7, we read that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Man became a living being. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the biblical creation model, I'm sure you can see, okay, bear with me, that the instant creation of organic life, instantly complex, interrelated biological systems, would indeed prove fatal for Darwinian evolution. If this is true, the theory of evolution would fall. I think we can all agree with that, at least in theory. And I'm using that in the modern day vernacular. But can it be scientifically proven, is the question. Can it be proven scientifically that organic life was fully formed from the beginning? To be honest, I don't know that it can be. After all, none of us were there. None of us were there allegedly 4.6 billion years ago or 3.5 billion years ago. We weren't there, so I don't know that I can prove it scientifically. However, I do believe that the creation model offers the best interpretation of the data. Let's consider a couple of examples, some lines of evidence, if you will, for this prediction. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about something that many of you, I'm sure, have heard of, and that is the idea of irreducible complexity. This term was coined by Michael Behe in his book, Darwin's Black Box. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of that book. Let's let Mr. Behe define this concept. By irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. An irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to any irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. An irreducibly complex biological system, if there is such a thing, would be a powerful challenge to Darwinian evolution. And Michael Behe goes on to give us an example that I think we can all relate to. You've seen this diagram before, I'm sure, and that is the example of a mousetrap. A mousetrap, as you know, consists of 5 interacting pieces: the base, the catch, the spring, the hammer, and the holding ball. And all of these pieces must be in place in order for the mousetrap to function. If there are irreducibly complex biological systems, then not only must we discard the theory of evolution, we must acknowledge the only alternative, and I hope this comes up again later, the only alternative, which is creation. I want to talk about 2 examples. I want to illustrate this in 2 ways this evening. Our first example is the process of protein production. According to Regina Bailey, biology expert, proteins are very important molecules in our cells. They are involved in virtually all cell functions. In other words, if this process stops, you effectively will die. So let's look at this. The blueprints or codes for proteins are found on the DNA double helix. This code consists of a series of specific amino acids, and those amino acids consist of what are called nucleotides. We're going to come back to some of this in just a few minutes, assuming I have some time. These amino acid chains are linked together by peptide bonds. Then, in order for the code to be sent to production, here's what has to happen. Something called RNA polymerase has to come and unzip the DNA double helix. Then, once it makes the copy, once it follows that DNA template string like a train on tracks, once it does that and makes the copy of that amino acid sequence, it's got the code now. Then what happens is it's called a pre-RNA molecule. And it has to undergo the process of splicing, where introns are removed. Then a pony A tail consisting of adenine bases is added to one end, and a guanosine triphosphate is added to the other end. Once this happens, the pre-mRNA molecule becomes a messenger RNA molecule. It exits the nucleus of the cell, and it goes to what's called, and this is really neat, it goes to what's called the ribosome, which is a large and complex molecular machine found within all living cells that serves as the primary site of biological protein synthesis. Within the ribosome, now, there is a large ribosomal unit and a small ribosomal unit. The small unit reads the mRNA like a tape going through a tape recorder. And the large subunit joins the necessary amino acids based on the genetic code to form specific proteins. And I did some research on that, and if anyone here, like Ben is a biologist and knows better, let me know, but the research I did indicated that there are about 100,000 different proteins in the human body alone. And so my point simply is this, that in order for this process to work, you have to have multiple parts present and working together. You have to have the RNA polymerase, you have to have the peptide bonds, the splicing process has to occur. You have to have the ribosome, and it has to have the large and small part. And so again, all these parts have to be there in order for that to work. My second example, and this one's a lot more fun, one of my favorites. I grew up watching Woody Woodpecker, so this is kind of fun to talk about. I'm from Kentucky. We had a lot of woodpeckers back then. You guys don't seem to have very many here. Woodpeckers are very interesting creatures. As you know, they peck holes in trees, and then they shoot their long tongue into that hole in order to grab, to locate the grubs, the worms, the bugs that are inside the tree. So here's what has to happen. Because just imagine, if you've got a long tongue, where are you going to put it? It's going to hang out. It's going to dangle out, right? That's not a very good survival trait. And so what the woodpecker does is its tongue comes out the right side of its mouth, wraps around its head, goes under a fold of skin, comes back on the left side through a hole in the beak, and that way the slat is taken care of. On the tip of the tongue is a barb with glue on it. And this unique design allows the woodpecker to extend its tongue 6 inches into the hole of a tree. But that's not it. In addition to the woodpecker's tongue, it has a unique self-sharpening tongue, bill that works like a chisel. It has a complex mechanism for locating and hitting the tiny grubs inside the tree. It has a shock absorption system in its skull to protect it from damage. And this system consists of, number one, a beak made of elastic material, the hyoid, a spongy bone located behind the beak, and a special skull bone containing spinal fluid. There's also the woodpecker's tail feathers. The tail feathers, especially the central one or 2 pairs, are stronger in woodpeckers, resisting the wear caused by their use and propping up the bird's body as it hammers with the bill. The toe structure and associated arrangement of tendon and leg muscles form a functional complex of features enabling the woodpecker to climb tree trunks and to maintain its position while pecking the tree. And so in order for the woodpecker to be a woodpecker, it has to have all these parts functioning in concert with one another. Without the spongy bone behind the beak, or the excess spinal fluid in the skull bone, the woodpecker's head would be crushed on impact. But even with the shock-absorbing system, pecking holes in trees would be useless without a long tongue. And then there's the way it wraps its long tongue around the back of its head. Please explain to me that evolutionary process. It seems to me that there would be no middle ground. Either you got a little tongue or you got a long tongue and it's wrapped around your head. And I don't understand how that process could evolve. I don't understand how all of these parts could evolve in concert with each other over a span of, I don't know what they would suggest, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years. But that's another example from the natural world of an irreducibly complex system. Now, in response, I understand that many evolutionists will offer up simple step-by-step processes in order to explain away these many examples. But you've got to understand two things about that. Number one, different stages of complexity don't equate an evolutionary path. What Ben has to do, if he chooses to address this, is prove how these systems could have evolved by small steps and how each updated system would have been useful to the organism. Even if he can show this, it's not only purely hypothetical, it's still mathematically impossible to get a series of related mutations that bring about greater complexity, and that's something I'll talk about in my second speech. And so if the irreducible complexity argument holds up, if it does, and remember, we've only discussed two examples of thousands, not only is the theory of evolution nixed, more importantly, the creation model becomes the only viable explanation, and it's certainly, I believe, the most logical explanation. In addition to irreducible complexity, there's also the concept of information and language. Werner Gitt, in an article, Scientific Laws of Information and Their Implications, Part 1, says, and I quote, "The grand theory of atheistic evolution posits that matter and energy alone could have given rise to all things, including biological systems. To hold true, this theory must attribute the existence of all information, ultimately, to the interaction of matter and energy without reference to an intelligent or conscious source."
5 minutes.
Uh-oh. Then in another article, Mr. Gitt says, "A rigorous analysis of the characteristics of information demonstrate that living things intrinsically reflect both the mind and will of their creator." I better hurry. Let's consider 3 points about information. Number one, a material entity cannot generate a non-material entity. Number two, universal information is a non-material fundamental entity. It has no physical or chemical interaction with matter. It's not a property of matter. It does not originate pure matter. It's not correlated with matter. An American mathematician by the name of Norbert Wiener said, "Information is information, neither matter nor energy." I'm going to skip over some of this, and I'm going to get right to my example, the biological example that I want to talk about in illustrating what information is and how it points us to a creator. That is the genetic information contained in your DNA. There are 4 nucleotides, or letters, in what is called the genetic alphabet: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. To look at it another way, these 4 letters form a language of 3-letter words, or amino acids, and the genetic code chart translates this language for us, revealing the exact amino acids in any given sequence or strand. Amino acid sequences form proteins, which are instruction manuals for how the various systems in your body operate. Ralph Muncaster writes, "The average human body every second of every day is organizing about 150 quintillion amino acids into carefully constructed chains." And the blind watchmaker, Richard Dawkins, said, "There's enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over." So the question is, where does that information come from? Which is more scientific? Which is observable? Which can be experimented upon? Does such purposeful complexity, can it be observed to evolve via random, unguided processes? Or is it more observed in our world today that such purposeful complexity has only been observed to come from intelligence? If it's only been observed to come from intelligence, then we must conclude that the genetic information comes from an intelligent sender. I would posit that that would be God, specifically the God of the Bible, as you I'm sure would expect. And so that's prediction number 1, that God created life fully formed. Prediction number 2, God made distinct kinds of organisms. In Genesis 1, we learned that God created all living things to reproduce according to their kind. And therefore, we should see distinct animal groups that remain in equilibrium or stasis throughout the fossil record and that perpetuate today. If we see groups of animals remaining in this kind of equilibrium, then not only does the theory of Darwinian evolution fall apart, but the creation model is upheld.
Casey, you got 2 minutes. Maybe you should ask God to slow down time.
All right. Charles Darwin acknowledged this problem in his book, The Origin of Life. That numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection. Now, he assumed that there would be a solution to this. I'm not trying to misrepresent him. But what I'm arguing is that even he knew that this could falsify the theory of macroevolution. Richard Dawkins says regarding the Cambrian explosion that we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appeared. It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. George Gaylord Simpson acknowledged regarding horse evolution that the earliest and most primitive known members of every order already have the basic ordinal characters. Stephen Jay Gould acknowledged this problem as well in 1982.
1 minute.
1 minute? All right, the coelacanth, millipedes, jellyfish, insects, and there are many other examples illustrate the fact that fossils emerge fully formed in the fossil record, continue in stasis until today. They look the same today, and that would prove equilibrium as far as I'm concerned. Even today, animals reproduce after their own kind. Giraffes produce giraffes, rabbits produce rabbits, dolphins, dolphins, ducks, ducks. I had another third prediction that I'm not going to be able to get to this evening, and that is that man is unique in God's creation. Simply put, I think we all know by observation alone that man is very different than everything else. The Bible predicts dominion. The Bible predicts that we would be made in the image of God. These things are seen, visualized even today, and I've got much more to say on that. So in conclusion, the question is there scientific evidence for the idea of creation? Do we see instant complexity? Do we see equilibrium and stasis? And do we see a distinction made between God, man, and animals today? Sorry I had to rush there. I apologize. Hopefully we'll get back to some of that later.
Well done, I never expected to be more overwhelmed by the science on the creation side than I was on the other side. A lot of information and a lot of good stuff. So now we're going to have the answer period for Dr. Bongo, Dr. Drum, and he will have 15 minutes to respond to what he just heard the good Casey tell us. 15 minutes. My time.
Okay, I'm actually not rebutting what Casey just said right now. I'll be doing that in about 30 minutes. Right now, what I'm going to do is give a pre-prepared presentation about creationism. Casey will be doing the same thing about evolution when I'm finished, and then we'll rebut what we've just said. So, I'm afraid I'm going to have to start off by flatly disagreeing with my opponent, who I must admit spoke very eloquently. But I don't think creationism is science, and I'm going to try to show to you why that is. So, creationism. Where is my laser pointer, Casey? You're trying to sabotage me?
You'll get one extra bonus for the theft of the laser pointer.
Thank you. Okay. So the title of my second presentation is Creationism Not as Predictable as You Think. And we're going to find out why that has significant meaning. So in my first presentation, we briefly went through the scientific method, how it works, why it's important. So this is how we define what science is, our observations, make a hypothesis, testable, repeatable, predictions, and experiments. What we learned as well is the scientific theories and laws have to be falsifiable in order to be valid. We learned that at the core of the scientific method, it's based on testable predictions, isn't it? I'm going to try and explain to you now why creationism does not fall within the realm of the scientific method. I'll briefly go through everything and then we'll get into detail of each point. But initially, as Casey has already alluded to us, creationism invokes the supernatural, a supernatural creator, which cannot be investigated using the scientific method. Instead of making falsifiable predictions, on the whole, there are some exceptions. Creationism makes post hoc interpretations to make data fit. And what I mean by that is, instead of making predictions and then getting the data, Creationism examines the data of other scientists and interprets it to fit their worldview. And that's not science. On the whole, the claims of creationism are unfalsifiable. And something we've seen a bit of already, instead of making testable predictions and performing experiments of their own, creationism, on the whole, with some exceptions, merely tries to attack evolution, trying to say, well, if we attack evolution, that's evidence for creationism. So I want to go into each of these points in a little bit of detail. First, the supernatural. Using the scientific method, we can only study the natural world. It's just the way it is. Science is limited in studying natural events, natural causes, and studying experiments with natural empirical evidence. Non-natural causes and events cannot be investigated by the scientific method. And as we learned already from the first presentation, scientific knowledge is itself derived from the scientific method. And if we can't investigate the supernatural using this method, it cannot be scientific. Scientists refer to this as methodological naturalism. And what that means is, in order to investigate something scientifically, we have to look for a natural explanation for it, because it's the only way we can investigate it, gather data, and test it. This doesn't mean the supernatural realm doesn't necessarily exist. Nobody is trying to say that. Nobody is trying to say God isn't real. Nobody is trying to say the supernatural realm doesn't exist or isn't possible. All we're trying to say is, to call something scientific, we have to look for natural causes. And there are many problems that lead off from this in creationism. Creationism tries to explain biological complexity by pointing to a supernatural creator that is even more complex than the life forms it's trying to explain, and then demands that the complexity of that creator requires no explanation of its own. This is grossly unscientific, circular reasoning. As my friend the Velociraptor has often wondered, if God created everything, who created God? If your explanation for complexity is God, you haven't explained anything. What could be more complicated than God? Creationism doesn't provide any testable or falsifiable mechanism for the emergence of species or biodiversity. Again, it merely possesses a mysterious creator who is unseen, untestable, and unfalsifiable. We don't know about biological complexity. We look to the Bible, that's where they start from, insert God. In this way, creationism is nothing more than another instance of the God of the gaps. We don't know, insert God. Instead of making falsifiable predictions as demanded by the scientific method, creationism makes post hoc interpretations to make data fit. But there's a problem with that. Because given the vagueness of creationism, any discovery can be made compatible with the hypothesis. And this totally strips it of any predictive power whatsoever. It really is not, and I cannot stress this enough, it is not scientific to say, we interpret the same evidence as you differently, therefore it's as valid as yours. Sometimes scientists interpret things differently, that's true, but they put their money where their mouth is. They go back to the lab, do repeatable, testable experiments, publish in critical scientific journals, and continue being scientists. This is the opposite of what creationism does. Interpretation is fine, but you've got to back it up with science. Until you do repeatable experimental data based on specific and falsifiable predictions, this is special pleading and nothing more. And it's the antithesis of the scientific method. Do you remember earlier on, I gave some examples of how evolution can be falsified? If, for example, we found the more complicated fossils mixed in with the simple ones and intact rock layers, can you say there's such a thing to be said of creationism? How could it be falsified? Well, of course, we'd expect the complex fossils mixed in with the simple ones. Rapid burial and the flood would explain that. It can't be falsified. Do you remember when we looked at the genetic code? Evidence for evolution, the common genetic code, the shared ancestry. Again, apparently this is evidence for creationism. But imagine it was the other way around. If every organism had a unique genetic code, evolution would just immediately fall. But in creationism, no problem. It's just the way God did it. He created every organism, He designed the genetic codes to be different. If you can't falsify your ideas, you are not performing science. Again, we've seen a little bit of this already. There seems to be some confusion about how evidence for creationism is somehow negative arguments against evolution. The idea of intelligent design, irreducible complexity, which Casey did a great job of defining for us, so I won't go into it too much. But these try to make vaguely scientific predictions. If something is irreducibly complex, it had to have been designed. But the problem with that is, when you actually do apply the full scientific method, almost any example of irreducible complexity, and I'll get to it in my rebuttal later, can be refuted. Another example of predictions going awry in creationism is this. Remember we talked earlier about marsupials in Australia. According to the creationism model, Noah's Ark landed somewhere in Turkey on Mount Arafat. All the marsupials traveled from Asia Minor, across the Asian landmass, the Indian subcontinent, swam through the Indian Ocean, possibly the Pacific, and landed in Australia. We can think of this as a scientist. We really can. We can make predictions based on that. We would predict that we should find marsupial fossils somewhere between Turkey and Australia. But we don't. We could predict that possibly there was a land bridge which the marsupials crossed to get to Australia. We should find geological evidence of such destruction. But we never have. The bacterial flagellum is probably one of the most famous examples of the idea of irreducible complexity, laid out in Michael Behe's wonderful 1996 book, Darwin's Box. The idea of the bacterial flagellum is that if you take any part of it out, it ceases to work. Creationists think this is a prediction gone well for them. Unfortunately, if you do the scientific method and read scientific papers, this just isn't true. We know we can take parts of the flagellum out and it still works. Maybe not as well as efficiently, but it works. I don't know if you can read the labels, but if you see these L and P rings, we can take those out and the thing still works. We can take certain proteins out of this and it will work. Maybe not as well, but it'll still work. Many of the proteins are homologous, that is the same, of proteins of other structures in bacteria. They do the same job. Not only that, but the flagellum isn't even one thing. There are hundreds of varieties of the flagellum. So the perfect example of irreducible complexity actually shows a lot of variation in what it needs to work, doesn't it? And the problem here is, even if you did disprove evolution, which I'm open to, as a scientist, you should always be critical of your ideas. But all your work is still ahead of you. Attacking evolution is not evidence for creationism. You need positive evidence for your hypothesis. You can't just say, well, my cup is empty, therefore there's tea in it. It could be anything in it. You have to prove what is in it. Another huge problem we find in creationism, which is really against the scientific method, is refusal to accept contrary evidence to your position. In science, we're required to modify our ideas in the light of new evidences.
But 5 minutes, Doctor. 5 minutes.
Creationism doesn't do this. Another example of irreducible complexity is the blood clotting cascade or the immune system. Again, Dr. Behe shows up, and in the Dover trial in 2004 about intelligent design in schools, he was presented with an entire list of scientific evidence showing that his position was incorrect. Any scientist should give ground. What did Dr. Behe say? Not good enough. What would be good enough, I would have to ask? How much evidence do you need? We talked about how important peer review is. But creationists have their own peer-reviewed articles, don't they? The Journal of Creation. Well, I'm afraid to inform you all, this is not real peer review. The idea of scientific peer review is to be as critical of the scientific method as possible, to ensure that bad science is weeded out. Whereas in creation journals, the huge confirmation bias. The articles are only sent to other creationists. There is no critical examination of the scientific data, the methodology, or the research. And websites such as Antis and Genesis, or Center for Scientific Creation, anybody can start a website, start a blog, use scientific words, scientific phrases, even recruit people with scientific credentials. But until you adhere to the scientific method, you're not doing science. Sure, there's a Journal of Creation, but this shouldn't be called science. If creationism is allowed to circumvent the scientific method and publish things like this and still be called science, why can't this? This is a Journal of Astrology. It's peer-reviewed by other astrologers. Why can't this be called science if creationism is? What about this homeopathic journal? Why is this allowed to circumvent the scientific method? What about this Bigfoot journal? The editor of this journal has a PhD in biology. He peer-reviewed his articles, but he didn't do the scientific method. It's not science. What about controversy? There's no real controversy in the scientific community. In the scientific community, with those who adhere to the scientific method, it really is beyond reasonable doubt that creationism is not science, as defined by the scientific method. Some scientists are of the opinion that creationism is true, and that's fine. But they haven't published in scientific journals, they haven't presented scientific data, they haven't been critical of the data as a scientist would, so it's not science. And I'll reiterate this again, a scientist's opinion is not scientific. You have to put your money where your mouth is. Published in critical scientific journals. In order for us to say creationism is a science, we would need to change the very definition of what science is. And to round off with another quote from my good pal, Dr. Beattie, a broadened definition of science to allow creationism would also embrace astrology. If we're not going to allow astrology in, we can't allow creationism, then can we?
2 minutes.
So if we're asking ourselves, does creationism follow the scientific method? Does it require data? Does it get peer-reviewed by critical science who are testing it for the scientific method? Does it make testable predictions? I'm afraid to inform you, it doesn't do any of these things. So in order to be defined as science, we need to change what science is. But for right now, as we define science today in this room, creationism does not fit the criteria for a valid scientific theory. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Drum. Now that every God-fearing person in the room wants to cast your charred bones into the depths of hell, let's hear from Casey Head and why he thinks that your theory is nonsense.
All right, thank you. Sorry about the rushing at the end of my last speech. I feel terrible about that. Hopefully we'll get to come back to some of that material during the cross-examination and the audience Q&A. My best part was there at the end, and you guys missed it, so sorry about that. Author and IT professional, Mr. Chuck Eastham, is noted for saying that young Earth creationism is essentially the position that all modern science, 90% of living scientists, 98% of living biologists, all major university biology departments, every major science journal, the American Academy of Sciences, and every major science organization in the world are all wrong regarding the origins and development of life, but one particular tribe of uneducated, Bronze-Age goat herders got it exactly right. There may be some of you here this evening that would view folks like me and Beattie and many others in the same light. And I understand that. I truly do. But let me make it very clear that while I do oppose evolution because it contradicts the Bible, I will admit that from the start, I also disagree and reject the theory of evolution on scientific grounds, and I do hope that you will hear me out on that in this particular speech. Let's begin by defining evolution. I do disagree slightly with Ben's definition. Let's talk about that. Many define evolution as simply change over time. Listen, that happens. We have dog breeds today that didn't used to exist. We don't see velociraptors roaming the planet anymore. So change certainly does happen. Charles Darwin didn't like the word evolution because it had such a broad meaning, and so he chose the expression descent with modification. From About Education, an online source, they say, simply put, descent with modification means that traits are passed down from generation to generation and sometimes undergo changes or modifications over time. From reading evolution, evolution is not only change in living things, but specifically it is descent with modification. This means that organisms living today have descended from earlier ancestors who were modified or physically changed through the course of their descent. Believe it or not, I agree with that as well. Change happens, and descent with modification happens as well. No one is going to deny this. No one should deny this. Then there's the idea of natural selection, which Ben did discuss. Ed Grabianowski, with How Stuff Works, explains it this way. Natural selection is the engine that drives evolution. The organisms best suited to survive in their particular circumstances have a greater chance of passing their traits on to the next generation. It's like artificial breeding, but the farmer is nature. The fastest gazelle is going to survive. The bird with the biggest beak capable of cracking the hardest nut is going to have a better chance of surviving. We all agree with change. We all agree with the simple modification. I look different than my dad, my granddad, etc. And we all agree, I should say, with natural selection as well. There's a great classic example of natural selection that I agree with. The peppered moths example, dating all the way back to pre-industrial England. I agree that this happens, that animals change due to natural selection. Ben did a great job of defining that, and so I'm not going to spend any time further defining natural selection. Suffice it to say, I do agree with it. But here's where we run into problems in evolution and evolutionary theory. Again, Marshall Brain says, it's interesting to note that in all of the selective breeding of dogs, there has been no change to the basic dog's genome. All breeds of dog can still mate with one another. People have not seen any increase in dogs' DNA, but have simply selected different genes from the existing dog gene pool to create different breeds. There's a difference between macro and microevolution. You see, natural selection can only select from the traits, the genetic information, that are already present in the organism. So you might get a smaller dog, but it's still a dog. You might get a finch with a bigger beak, but it's still a finch. You might get a faster horse, but it's still a horse. This is microevolution, which is defined as varieties within a given type. And it happens all the time. But natural selection, in and of itself, cannot and will not lead to large-scale changes over time, what we call molecules-to-man evolution or macroevolution. For large-scale changes to occur, something called mutations have to happen, so that new genetic information can be added to that organism's genome. You have to have mutations in order for evolution to work. Ben didn't talk about that. Douglas Fatuma from Action Bioscience explains there cannot be evolution without genetic variation in the first place. So there must be mutation and often recombination to generate the different genotypes or the different versions of the genes, known as alleles, which then may or may not make a difference in the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. You can't have any evolutionary change whatever without mutation, and perhaps recombination giving rise to genetic variation. Jerry Coyne agrees with this. I read his book in preparing for this debate. The first is the idea of evolution itself. This simply means that a species undergoes change over time. That is, over many generations, a species can evolve into something quite different. And those differences, those differences are based on changes in the DNA which originate as mutations. Natural selection happens all the time. Variety does arise. Black and brown dogs, smaller and bigger beaks, etc. In fact, wide variety can arise as a result. Again, this is microevolution and presents no problem to the creation model. But in order for the theory of evolution to be true, Darwinian evolution, in order for dinosaurs to evolve into birds, and for something that looks like a hyena or hippo to evolve into a whale, you have to have advantageous mutations and lots of them. And this is, I believe, where the theory of evolution falls apart. Let's talk about the problem with this aspect of Darwinian evolution. Regarding mutations, note, they are mostly random. They usually aren't that common. Dr. Lawrence Lowe with Nature says mutation rates are usually very low. They must occur in reproductive cells to be heritable, obviously. Reversions, where a mutation is reversed, are apparently common. There's also something called DNA repair that repairs most point mutations where a nucleotide error occurs. But here's the main point. Most mutations, as you might know, are either harmful or they are neutral. Dr. Gary Barker says mutations are not genetic script writers. They are merely typographic errors in a genetic script that has already been written. Typically, a mutation changes only one letter in a genetic sentence, averaging 1,500 letters long. Again, our good friend Marshall Brain says evolution's mutation mechanism does not explain how growth of a genome is possible. How can point mutations create new chromosomes or lengthen a strand of DNA. Dr. Gary Parker again discusses this in his book, Creation Facts of Life. He says the mathematical problem for evolution comes when you want a series of related mutations. The odds of getting two mutations that are related to one another is the product of their separate probabilities. In other words, if a fly has one mutation, it might result in a bent wing, but it's still a fly. In order for macroevolution to occur, you need a series of related mutations that build on one another in order to get from a simpler organism to a more complex organism. Gary Parker again says that there is one mutation for every 10 million duplications of a DNA molecule. In a Nature article by Leslie Prey from 2008, scientists have reported mutation rates as low as one mistake per 100 million to 1 billion nucleotides, mostly in bacteria, and as high as one mistake per 100 to 1,000 nucleotides, the latter in a group of error-prone polymerase genes in humans. Let's talk about this. I'm going to be very generous. I'm a nice guy. And I'm going to go with a very high mutation rate of 10 to the negative third. That's one mutation in every 1,000 nucleotides. So in order to get a series of related mutations for a new biological system to evolve, for example, the odds, again, are the product of their separate probabilities. So 10 to the third times 10 to the third times 10 to the third results in 10 to the negative 27th. And what this means is that to bring about macroevolutionary change in the eye, for example, the probability would be 1 in, not 2. That's in order for a series of related mutations to occur. Jay Kimball, from Mutations and Evolution, I threw that picture in there, I thought you guys would enjoy that. He says, so how can the small changes in genes caused by mutations, especially single base substitutions or point mutations, lead to the large changes that distinguish one species from another? These questions have, as yet, only tentative answers. But not only do mutations utterly fail to drive macroevolutionary change, it appears from my study that they're actually driving evolutionary decline and deterioration. The second law of thermodynamics says that in any cyclic process, the entropy will either increase or remain the same. The concept of entropy is that nature tends from order to disorder in isolated systems. Roger Lewin wrote in 1982 in an article in Science. He said, one problem biologists have faced is the apparent contradiction by evolution of the second law of thermodynamics. Systems should decay through time, giving less, not more, order. So the second law of thermodynamics and the law of entropy remain a real problem for evolutionists. How can disorder lead to such incredible order when some of the most fundamental laws of physics dictate the opposite? Along these same lines, there's the issue of genetic load. From Evo Wiki. Genetic load is a measure of the number of harmful mutations an average member of a population is carrying. Most individuals in stable populations carry a number of recessive lethal mutations termed their genetic load. To put it more simply, it's the idea that mutations build up and become a load or burden. Think about it. If more mutations are deleterious or harmful rather than helpful, how can true macroevolutionary progress take place? It's like taking one step back, assuming you get an advantageous mutation, one step forward, and then taking 2 steps back. That's not the recipe for molecules to man evolution. So not only does Ben need to show us how random mutations can account for macroevolutionary change, he needs to answer the problem of genetic load by either showing, number one, how beneficial mutations outpace harmful ones, or how harmful mutations can be removed from the genome. So I agree that microevolution occurs all around us. Nature selects from the existing genetic information those traits which are the most adaptive, resulting in variety, different breeds of dogs and horses, bigger beaks on finches, etc. But in order for macroevolution to be true, as Ben is affirming tonight, new genetic information has to be added to get from a hippo to a whale, for example. And according to evolutionists, this new genetic information comes as a result of mutation, which we've talked about. This is untenable both mathematically and scientifically. In fact, I believe it takes a whole lot more faith to believe in macroevolution because of these reasons than it does to believe in creation. I had a few other things planned. I think I'm about out of time. So I'll go ahead and give the floor back.
You got a little over 2 minutes.
Oh, do I? All right, sweet. Yeah, I talked a lot for 3 minutes.
Take your time.
All right, good deal. All right, I will talk about some of the issues that Ben raised. Regarding transitional fossils, he mentioned Tiktaalik, he mentioned the whale evolution. This is just a summary. I'm sure we'll come back and talk about this. Many of these have been exaggerated. Pakicetus is a great example. I hope that comes back up. Somebody asked a question about Pakicetus. Many have characteristics that are seen in creatures alive today. Regarding the Tiktaalik, there are creatures alive today that share the same traits, yet they're alongside these other animals that they're alleged to be transitioning between. There's often disagreement, even among evolutionists, about the identity and transitional status of these fossils. It's an assumption that they were transitional. Evolutionary presuppositions are required. Creationist looks at the Tiktaalik, for example, and says, you know what? All that tells me is that that animal lived. That's all we can discern from that. That's the only fact we can draw. To assert that it's a transitionary fossil involves presuppositions. You weren't there to see it happen, is the point. Let's, how much time do we have?
1 minute, 6 seconds.
All right, good deal. Let's see. Let's talk about junk DNA and pseudogenes. I'm sure many of you followed the Human Genome Project that was pretty popular here a few years back. What they discovered is that there's a lot more function to the genome than previously understood. Ongoing research is assigning more and more function to the so-called non-protein coding genes. Pseudogenes do not prove common descent. Ben brought up the calcium gene, also known as the GLUO pseudogene. Just something interesting to point out. What they do is they say that because we share this with chimps, we must have evolved from chimps. We also share it with guinea pigs. I don't think we evolved from guinea pigs. Besides, loss of gene function fits the creation model, i.e. the fall. It may be overhyped and misinterpreted, but does take place and doesn't present a problem for creationists. Looking at vestigial organs, looking at junk DNA, looking at atavisms. In some of these examples, it's not necessarily true that this denies the creation model. Creation acknowledges loss of function.
Thank you, Casey. Wrap it up. Very smart. Very good time. Very good time. You know, this is a bit of a long program. It's kind of a marathon, but we're not going to take a break. If you need to slip out, there's a water fountain right out here, restrooms out here, but we're just going to keep moving on. And this is great stuff. So next we are going to have our rebuttals. First up, Dr. Drummond. You can applaud. You got 5 minutes for this.
Okay, let me start off by saying I really wish I had more than 5 minutes, so if I miss anything, please make sure to ask me in the Q&A. So Casey's told us a lot about creationism tonight. He's also told us a lot about evolution. But as a scientist, it seems to me that Casey has some profound misunderstandings of what evolution is and how it works. And there are a few main points I want to get through very quickly. It might be flip-flopping, so excuse me. The first thing I want to touch on is the most obvious thing. Casey just told us about the second law of thermodynamics, about how it's a huge problem for evolution. He defined it correctly for us that in a closed system, entropy or unuseful energy tends to increase. There's just one problem with his interpretation, though. Life on Earth is not in a closed system. The second law of thermodynamics has no issue at all with evolutionary theory, and to claim that it does either shows you don't really know what evolution is, or you don't know what the second law of thermodynamics actually says. Casey really likes the idea of the woodpecker, that this shows irreducible complexity. And I've come across this in many creationism arguments before, and again, it's mind-boggling. And it seems to be some kind of mistake about the woodpecker's anatomy. What you see in a woodpecker's anatomy is the same tongue anatomy you see in all birds, just longer. Unlike what Casey says, he did say something incorrect, that the tongue exits through the right nostril, goes through the back of the head, goes underneath some loose bit of skin, and comes out again. That's actually not what happens. It's exactly the same as in all of the birds. The tongue is attached to the mandible, the cartilage of the throat, and the base of the skull. just like a chicken, just like a parrot, just like any other bird you could choose to name. The only difference is that it's long. And anybody can look that up in a peer-reviewed scientific article if they choose. He told us about protein biosynthesis pathway, about how it is irreducibly complex. Again, perhaps Casey doesn't know about this, but if one reads a molecular biology textbook, there are many pathways which show much simpler versions of the way that he described to us, particularly prokaryotic and bacterial cells. To say it's irreducibly complex, I'm willing to give Casey the benefit of the doubt. We're good friends. I'm just going to assume he's not aware of the huge amount of data that is out there that actually contradict that. Casey mentioned to us many times the words, "I don't understand," or "I don't know how this could happen." Unfortunately, Mr. Head's position that he doesn't understand it is not evidence against it. There is huge swaths of scientific literature which show many of the positions he claims are irreducible or wrong. Well, I'm afraid that he is wrong. The mathematical statistics of related mutations is so wrong that anybody with a groundwork in molecular biology could work it out for themselves. Most mutations are not beneficial. This is true. It's been estimated that, for example, in humans, 1 in 175 mutations are beneficial. Most of the rest are neutral. But because of natural selection, it is beneficial mutations that get selected for. These thrive in populations. The genetic load, which Casey mentioned, beneficial mutations building up. Again, natural selection swoops in, takes out the beneficial selections before they take root in the gene pool. If you actually look long term of the numbers of beneficial mutations over neutral or harmful, most are beneficial due to natural selection. Bad mutations don't last very long due to the natural selection process. Beneficial ones do. We heard a lot about you can't add genetic information. Again, I forgive Casey for not knowing about this, because this is not easy stuff. If you knew about polyploid genome duplication, gene duplication itself, exon shuffling, gene fusion, gene fishing, transposable element protein domestication, you would know that there are many scientific peer-reviewed examples of how you add genetic mutation into a genome, no problem.
1 minute.
But again, these are big, scary words, and not everybody knows about them. But the great thing about science is that anybody can. Anybody can go look at the data, read up on the articles, become acquainted with the theory and the science, and see how it applies to evolution. And I guarantee, Casey's an intelligent guy, if he did that, he would see that the evidence is plain to see. It seems obvious to me, he's just not aware of it. We have seen a lot of the idea of contrived dualism tonight. Casey has told us a lot about how, well, if evolution falls apart, the only logical explanation is creationism. Again, just because there is no coffee in this doesn't mean there's automatically tea. If you disprove evolution tomorrow, that's great, but you still haven't proved creationism at all. It is a fallacy to say if you give evidence against evolution, it's evidence for creationism. And I'm probably low on time now, so again,
You're out of time, Doctor.
If I've missed anything, ask me in the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, Casey. You know, I'm starting to heat up a little bit. He said you're very smart, but he also called you profoundly wrong, if I was reading it correctly. So you got 5 minutes to wrap it up.
That's all right. I've got thick skin, maybe as a result of evolution mutations over time. Again, I agree with Ben. 5 minutes is not nearly enough time, Lord willing. Hopefully, I'll stick with Lord willing. We'll come back and talk about some of these things in the Q&A and cross-examination. I've numbered this in order of what I want to talk about. We'll see what I get to. Number one, Ben mentioned the idea on multiple occasions that if evolution is falsified, then it's wrong to assume that creation must be true. I've thought a lot about this, and again, this is one of those I can't understand, I don't understand. I'm asking for clarity, I'm asking for help from Ben, or from anybody on this issue. But if evolution isn't true, if we're not here as a result of mutations and the addition of genetic information over time, if we've not evolved from unicellular organisms to fish to frogs to whatever, then the only logical alternative to me is creation. If we didn't get here by successive changes, if we started out complex, then what does that imply? I don't think we've ever observed a dog just appearing from the dust out of nowhere. That's why I say that creation is the only alternative. I can't fathom, there's that language again, I admit, I can't fathom any other alternative. If Ben is aware of a fallback theory or hypothesis, I'd love to hear it. Ben mentioned the idea that we can't invoke greater complexity. When I look at a painting, a Van Gogh's Starry Night, is it a fallacy on my part to conclude that somebody painted that painting? The painter is more complex than the painting. We're invoking a greater complexity in that example. It's not ridiculous to say that by looking at creation, by looking at complexity and information in the natural world, that there must be an intelligence behind it. We do it all the time. There's no fallacy about that. I'm going to be honest with you for a minute. Ben mentioned the geographical distribution problem. How did kangaroos end up in Australia? I don't know. I don't think any of us truly knows. We weren't there. And that's something that I think we need to be honest with ourselves about. Ben mentioned the examples of irreducible complexity. He referred to scientific journals and research that had been done in the past to explain these problems. That may be. I don't have those journals in front of me. I'm asking my good friend Ben to explain that process to us so that we can understand. And again, as I mentioned before, there's a difference between a hypothetical step-by-step process and one that is sensible, one that can be mathematically explained, one that we can see, observe, whatever, but we need some information and some explanation on that. Ben mentioned that there are many examples where we have observed new information being added to the genome of an organism.
2 minutes.
Thank you. I want to be very quick going through this. I've got some more things I want to talk about. But let's consider the example of bacterial evolution. This is something that we hear a lot of evolutionists talking about all the time. We see evolution in the lab, they say. And they refer to these examples where a bacteria will learn, will adapt, will mutate to resist the antibiotics. But what I would suggest to you is that this displays more loss of information in most cases than rather a gain in information. An example is streptomycin, which attaches to a receptor site in the bacteria's ribosome. A point mutation at the ribosome can prevent the streptomycin from binding to the ribosome. While these mutations help the organism to resist the antibiotic or drug, they often weaken the organism in other ways. Jerry Bergman says numerous empirical studies have found that mutations that confer resistance decrease the fitness of bacteria in environments without antibiotics. So what appears to be a gain in information because it gains a new function, it can resist the antibiotic, is actually a loss in information. I'm going to see if it's the next slide here. There we go, this one. Jonathan Sarfati, hopefully this will be the last one I read. There's not so much an arms race as trench warfare or scorched earth policy. Many of the changes are destroying machinery that the enemy could otherwise use. Example given, defenders will destroy their own bridges to prevent an enemy crossing, sabotage their own factories if the enemy is using them to churn out armaments, burn their own crops if the enemy will run out of food. So we're not seeing a lengthening of the genome, we're seeing a loss of information that results in a temporary advantage. Take the bacteria out of that environment, take it away from the antibiotic, it's less functional. So we need to see an addition of information and adding to the genome. We need to see a sequence of advantageous mutations resulting in macroevolutionary change. And as far as I understand, we can't see that, observe that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. We're going to keep this moving right along. We're actually going to do a cross-examination period where they have prepared questions for one another. We're going to sit down, and they're going to have 2 minutes to answer their opponent's questions. Let's grab a seat, fellas. Who would like to go first? You hold the mic. You want to go?
Sure.
All right. What we're going to do is you have a prepared question, and you'll have 2 minutes to respond, and then you might have a few seconds, 20, 30 seconds to kick something back at him after that.
Oh, my turn. Ben, many recognize the difference between hard science and soft science. Ralph Muncaster writes in his book, Dismantling Evolution, he says most hard evidence involves mathematics, hard science experiments, and calculations have led to the laws and formulas of physics, thermodynamics, chemistry, and engineering, all hard sciences and all extremely predictable. He goes on to define soft science as educated guesses to find a result that may or may not be there. They can be based on suppositions. Do you see a difference between hard and soft science? If so, what evidences of evolution qualify as hard science? What evolutions would you consider to be soft science?
2 minutes.
I think the premise is false to begin with. There is just science. Science is defined by the scientific method. Anything outside of that is not science. What we find in the scientific method is a working strategy of how we observe things about the natural world. We make hypotheses about them, and we use testable, repeatable, falsifiable predictions to test those hypotheses. If you're not doing that, you're not doing science. So this idea of having a soft science where it's okay to circumvent some part of the scientific method is nonsense. Evolution fits the scientific method as well as any other scientific theory, such as gravity or germ theory, or the theory that the Earth revolves around the sun. These are all scientific theories, and evolution, based on the evidence of the scientific method, certainly deserves to be placed among those.
What about use these 2 mics there?
Hold on.
No.
Just take them off and hold them.
Yeah, hold it in your hands. It should be on. It's yours. So soft science isn't science. It doesn't fit the definition.
There is just science and non-science.
So I guess the concern I have is that when you look at pseudogenes or junk DNA, I can understand how you might put that into the category of hard science. But when you're looking at Archaeopteryx, when you're looking at Tiktaalik, when you're looking at whale evolution from a hippo-like ancestor, it seems to me that that's not quite the same. And that's the reason for my question. It seems as if you're taking a different approach, more of a historic and interpretative approach regarding the fossil evidence, for example, because you weren't there, neither was I, versus what you might observe in a lab. Now, I disagree with that evidence as well. We can talk about that later, but I do see a difference between the hard and soft science. And the way to test that is we can observe gravity, we can observe the laws today that you mentioned. Can we observe macroevolutionary change? If we can observe it, then I retract my position. But as far as I know, we can't and haven't yet observed it. If it's not observable, how is it hard science?
Interesting question. You referred to that earlier, the soft science. Maybe that's where you imply that there are times where in science it requires faith to believe it.
Absolutely.
Good question.
Okay, is this on? So Casey, you mentioned in your very first presentation about starting from the Bible. You claim you're a man of faith, and that's far from you. No problem saying that. Throughout your presentations tonight, you've said many times that we're looking at evidences together. We're looking at the same evidences, interpreting it differently. My question for you would be, and this is a thought experiment, so bear with me. If the evidence remained exactly the same as you described, but the Bible said that evolution is true. I know it doesn't, but if it did, would you still interpret the evidence for creationism? Or would you now say that in light of what the Bible says, I have to interpret it for evolution?
Tough question, and Christians are presented with that question quite often. The flat Earth idea came up centuries ago and was an issue or concern. Slavery, many other issues where the Christians of that day take an interpretation that doesn't fit scientific knowledge or scientific truth. I begin with the Bible. Prophecy, internal harmony, consistency, historical corroboration, archaeology, all of these reasons lead me to believe that the Bible is inspired. I don't start with the scientific method, I start with the Bible. If, however, I found a contradiction between science and between the Bible, in all honesty, I would assume that the Bible is true. Again, I have trouble, I'm being honest, I have trouble saying, I think it's arrogant, I think it's in the very least naive to say that we can know what was happening millions of years ago or billions of years ago. So I would rather side with my Creator God. If I believe this book is inspired, if I believe He exists, then He was there. So I'm going to assume that He knows more about it than scientists today who are interpreting evidence regarding what happened millions of years ago. So yes, I would, and I've wrestled with this. I'm from Kentucky. I wrestled with it. And so, and there was a time when I would have said, you know what, I might compromise the Bible to pursue scientific truth. I would not, because if I believe the Bible is infallible truth, I'm going to believe that and trust that regardless. And that doesn't mean that I don't, that I disagree with evolution for non-scientific reasons. I actually disagree with it, so it's quite convenient. But I hope that answers your question.
I want to thank Casey for being so blatantly honest with me. It's not an easy question to answer, but I think it's one that shows the real difference between creationism and valid science. Casey's just told us in his own words about how if he comes across a contradiction in the Bible and the scientific method, he has to choose the Bible. But as I hope we all know by now, anything outside the scientific method cannot be called scientific. And if we go back to the subtitle of tonight's debate, which has more scientific evidence, if somebody in this debate is willing to say that they would look outside the scientific method as something more valuable than the evidence of the scientific method itself, I think it shows that the position that they hold is intrinsically unscientific.
I've got a few seconds.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, it actually leads into my next question, which I'll get to in just a second. I guess I can go and ask it, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right.
Ask a question in left 2 minutes.
We'll reverse the thought experiment. How would you approach the work you do as a researcher differently if you believed in a creator? And in conjunction with that, if you believed, and I know you once did, but if you believed that the Bible was the inspired, infallible Word of God, would you take a different approach than what I'm taking?
That's a very fair question. In response to that, a little bit of background on myself. Some of you may know me. I'm an atheist. I haven't always been. I used to be a very devout Christian. I believed in God. But I was always a scientist first and a Christian second. I got into science at a very young age. I learned about the scientific method, and I learned about what a great tool it is for investigating the natural world. And never in my life, professional or otherwise, have I come across something when I thought, hey, is this science or is it not? I've always gone back to the scientific method, the rules a scientist must follow to be called true scientists. So no, if I came across a contradiction in the Bible, if the Bible says creationism is true, I have to go with the scientific evidence. It's the only way I can actually explain something and still call it science. I have no problem with people saying they believe in creationism. I really don't. I really don't have a problem with people believing in Noah's Ark, 6,000-year-old Earth. I really don't mind. But if people try to claim that that is science, that's a problem for me. And I would never sway the other way.
Well, we didn't quite get to the some of the scientific evidence for creation. We didn't talk about the flood and creation ex nihilo and so forth. But just in response, what do you think is the more consistent position? And you may not like the position, you may not find it a comfortable position, but if you believe it's the inspired, infallible Word of God, and God, the creator of all things, truly inspired and wrote this book through men, then aren't you going to trust an infallible God who was there over a post hoc interpretation of a fossil you find in some part of the world when you weren't there? Doesn't it make more logical sense, if you believe in this God, to trust that God over what you perceive may or may not have happened, allegedly hundreds or millions or billions of years ago? I don't care if you responded. No, it violates
Well, that's okay. Just as an observer here, it's fascinating to me because the questions that you're asking each other require you to step outside of your belief system, which is very different. Also fascinating to me that many people probably in this room started out as people of science and then were taken over in their life by the light of God and vice versa. And I think that's a whole other debate maybe for another evening. So who's got the next question?
One of the key criticisms you have of evolution is the rate of beneficial mutations occurring in a genome. According to the creationism story, though, Noah's Ark preserved 2 of each kind. And the age of the Earth is only 6,000 years. From Noah's Ark to now, approximately 4,000 years. You can correct me if that's wrong.
approximately.
Okay. But you would admit today that there's a huge variation within kinds through microevolution. This is a problem for me to understand because on one hand you claim that the rate of beneficial mutations is so astronomically low that it can't account for macroevolution. And yet the kind of variation between kinds that we observe today, if they came from only two ancestors 4,000 years ago, would have to be so astronomically high as to be almost unbelievable to a scientist. So you can't have both. What way is it? Are mutations very rare, or do they happen often? Or did God make them very fast after the ark and then slow it down? Could you elaborate?
It's a great question. To answer your question, I think there's a difference between natural selection, descent with modification, and mutations. Again, I've acknowledged that microevolutionary change happens. What I've denied is that mutations explain macroevolutionary change even over billions of years. So what I would suggest is not that mutations after the flood resulted in the variation we see today. I would argue that natural selection worked on the two of each kind post-flood and their descendants and resulted in the variation that we see today. Now, I agree, there are how many species today? Hundreds of thousands, millions, that many we haven't discovered yet. I understand that. And I don't know, but again, I wasn't there, and neither were you. So it could be that God caused variation to be at a faster rate. He caused natural selection to work greater due to environmental changes, drastic environmental changes in the post-flood world. But I don't know. I don't know the answer specifically because I wasn't there. But just to answer your question about mutations, again, I don't argue that mutations led to the variation we see today from the flood. I argue that natural selection and variation, not common descent, but descent with modification occurred, and that resulted in the variation.
It sounds like what you're saying, that's sort of the soft science on your side, where faith does have to fill in some of the...
I don't deny faith in my interpretation or interpretation of the past, but that's my point. None of us were there. All we can do is best interpret the evidence today, and I argue that it's not science versus faith. It's not that kind of contradiction. It's two worldviews approaching the same evidence with a different interpretation. We start from different presuppositions, would be my contention.
And I would say that I saw one man in the room who might have been there, who was pretty old.
Oh, my turn.
Yeah.
All
All right.
Ben, I was answering your question. Sorry. Let's see. Many organs and biological systems have been labeled vestigial and even functionless. And I do understand that vestigial doesn't equate non-function, according to evolutionary theory, which is a common misconception. I think that creationists have, by the way. I'll acknowledge and grant that. But they've been acknowledged or viewed as functionless even, only for scientists and doctors to later realize their value. Is there a rush to label things vestigial or junk, as in DNA, to support the evolutionary model? Is this an example where evolutionary presuppositions lead to bad science and even dangerous practices when it comes to the removal of some of these so-called vestigial organs that we've discovered do indeed have value?
Are you referring to the appendix?
The appendix, tonsils. I don't think anyone volunteers to have their tailbone removed, but
Right, I just wanted to say
those are the two that jump out.
That's a good point. We do know that some organ structures, genes that were originally thought to be vestigial, can become reactivated. This even happens with our tailbones. Some people have genetic mutations, which are called activisms. What the hell is that? It's throw it outside. It's been
I'll sacrifice myself.
Did somebody from Casey's side plant that time?
It wasn't me.
Sorry. Where were we?
So there are some structures that are originally thought to be vestigial, but turned out not to be. But we do know that there are true vestigial organs. The appendix is the one probably you're most familiar with. Let's be honest, guys, your appendix is not really good for much except for killing you, is it? How many people in this room have their appendix taken out? And you're still alive. Tell me that's not vestigial. If you can take the entire structure out and the organism can still function, that's vestigial. We see the same thing in junk or inactive genes. We've done molecular biology experiments in certain organisms where you can actually take the junk DNA out with no deleterious effect to the organism whatsoever. So I would agree with Casey in some instances that vestigial organs do have actual functions. But we know that vestigial organs and adjunct genes, inactive genes, do exist, and they're no longer needed by the organism, as evidenced by the fact that we can remove them to no effect in the organism whatsoever.
Well, I'm glad you clarified to no effect whatsoever, because you cut your leg off and still function as a human being and live. So I'm glad you added that part there at the end. I don't have time to address both the pseudogenes and the junk DNA and the appendix. But just regarding the appendix, I'll pull this up. I hope you don't mind, just real quick. Me reading this. But William Parker, he and his colleagues have suggested the appendix that it provides a safe house for beneficial gut bacteria to shelter when dangerous pathogens temporarily outcompete them. Another quote that I found interesting: it's hard to figure out what the appendix does when you're studying super clean animals and people. Where diarrheal disease is common, the appendix is vital for repopulating the intestines with helpful bacteria after the illness. My understanding is that even though it's been labeled vestigial or that it lacks function, that it very much serves a function in repopulating bacteria, gut bacteria. We may not need it as much in this country because we're so sanitary and clean, but that doesn't negate the fact that it does serve a purpose, can serve a purpose. And if it's functional, if it does serve a purpose, how is it vestigial, would be my question.
Can I just take a few seconds to respond to that? Well, I defined in the first presentation, vestigial doesn't mean useless or without function. Merely, it doesn't perform the function for which it was originally evolved.
How do you know?
Well, we can know by molecular biology that the appendix is actually a common ancestor of the cecum-type structure found in cows.
How do you know?
Science. You can measure how related the two genomes of different structures are. And through doing that, you see a branch of common descent, just like we do with whole genomes of entire organisms. There are books on molecular biology techniques that anybody can learn to go how to do this. And this has been replicated in laboratories all over the world.
Well, here's my point, though. If it's functional, why should we be quick to label it vestigial, number one? And number two, and I know we're kind of violating the order here.
It's all right.
Okay,
the clock is dead anyway.
That's true. There's no evidence. There's no hard science.
Last point on this, we'll move to the next one.
Okay. Here's my point about interpretation. A Christian, a creationist, looks at the same evidence and says, not common descent, but common design. That would only make sense. Why isn't that a... Well, he can't answer. So, I'll leave it at that. I say common design, not common design.
And I like how you said, because science, just like he says, because God. Yeah, it's the same again. There is faith on both sides. So I think you have one more question apiece. Is that? I think so. Okay, let's do it. Let's get it.
Casey, I outlined in my second presentation a little bit more about the scientific method. How the scientific method is defined today, that we can only use it to investigate the natural world, and we cannot use it to investigate the supernatural. It doesn't mean that the supernatural doesn't exist. It just means that scientifically we can't investigate it. Does creationism, as you would define it, necessitate the supernatural, as in a supernatural creator, in order to be called scientific? So would we have to allow supernatural investigations to be called scientific in order for creationism to be scientific?
No, I acknowledged in my first speech that was somewhat rushed, that science can't discern God in the fullest extent, and really any extent directly. I admit that, because he is supernatural. God created a natural world to operate according to natural laws. I admit faith. I admit that I begin with the Bible. I admit every bit of that. But again, going back to my first speech, the question that I pose is this, and the one that I presented in my presentation, is does the evidence best fit the creation model? I didn't quite get through all of it. But when I see information, when I see the genetic code, the question, the typical question is who wrote the code? How do you get that kind of complexity of information in the world and without a creator? To me, if we look at a code or a language, or we see design, or we see complexity, a car, you know the examples, a computer, we infer creation, we infer intelligent design. It's the same way with my position. I see language in the genome. I see irreducible complexity. I see these things and conclude logically that there must be an intelligent designer. Now, I'm not necessarily in this discussion defining that as being the God of the Bible. That's a separate talk. Now, I do believe that, but in the end, I believe logically and scientifically, if we follow the scientific method and if we define science in part as based on observation, The only way we know for information to come into this world is by an intelligence center. If you know of another source, we can discuss it, but I'm not aware of that source. So if information only comes from intelligence, and if we see genetic information in the genetic code, which you know is complex, why is it unscientific to infer a creator or an intelligence center? And then we can, after this, go have a Bible study and talk about the God of the Bible and why he's the intelligence center.
Let's give him half a minute to address.
Yeah, of course.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't allow the supernatural to be scientific, except in this case, because you can't figure out how else it could come into play. Unfortunately, that's really not how science works. Think of this example. If your car breaks down, and you have no idea how to fix a car, you have no clue how the inside of an engine works. Either do I. But you don't assume that there's some supernatural reason why your car is broken down. You look for a natural explanation. You take the car to a mechanic. He doesn't. Even then, you don't assume there's some supernatural reason. The mechanic doesn't know, but there's still a natural reason. You're thinking like a scientist when you do that. When you come across a brick wall in science, you don't throw up your hands and say, okay, I can't figure this out. There's no way for me to figure this out, so I must go to the supernatural. That is probably the most unscientific thing anybody can do. You have to keep pursuing a natural explanation. Because of the scientific method, it is the only way that we have ever been able to adequately explain something scientifically.
I think you were describing a situation where a mechanic just wanted to charge you more money. Last question.
All right.
Did you want to 5 seconds on it? Just a few.
Yeah, I do, and I forget what I was going to say, so I'll just jump into my next question, if that's all right. Let's see, I've got 4 left. Which one do I want it to be? Sure. And I'll admit I don't know a lot about this, so I'm truly positing this to you. I don't have a counter response. Can you explain how, specifically how, and why, from a biological standpoint, sexual reproduction came to be in the evolutionary model, since the original unicellular organisms were asexual and reproduced via mitosis? How did that happen in the evolutionary model, as far as you know?
That's a great question. And it is true that initially life on Earth did not reproduce sexually. It was a lot through horizontal gene transfer, which is where you insert your genome into a whole other organism, share genetic information. Why did that come about? We're still not entirely sure, but there's some good working hypotheses within the evolutionary model. For example, we know that sexual reproduction allows more variation in the gene pool, which allows for more beneficial mutations to occur, and it helps build up more beneficial mutations for the survival of the organism. And we see that all the time in bacteria. For example, there have been bacterial species that have developed whole new ways of sharing their genetic information because they're hypermutable. For example, certain disease states in the lungs. Bacteria can do this because increased mutations gives them a better chance of survival. And again, we don't have the totally nailed down, but there are some really great scientific hypotheses of how it could work. And this is the great thing about science. We're humble enough to say we're not entirely sure yet, but we'll continue to gather evidence based on the scientific method until we know. But there are still some very good plausible methods out there of why sexual reproduction came about. But we haven't got it open yet.
Perhaps God just said, let there be fun.
That'll do,
That must have been pretty boring before that. Let it lay around by yourself. Anyway, we're each going to have 5 minutes. Did you want to add one more sentence to that?
Just one more. You mentioned hypotheses, and you mentioned I don't know, which, again, I've mentioned multiple times. How many hypotheses and I don't knows will there be until it becomes not fact or theory in the scientific sense, but an hypothesis itself?
Can I just quickly elaborate? It's important to establish that evolution, in terms of science, is a fact, in the same way as gravity. It is a fact that apples fall from trees. Gravity is the scientific theory that explains that fact. It is a fact that organisms on Earth have changed over time. Evolution by natural selection is the scientific theory that explains that fact. We don't have all the mechanisms worked out, but in the scientific community, when you look at the scientific evidence as gathered by the scientific method, there is no doubt that evolution happened. We don't know about the intricacies of every single thing, but that does not negate the whole theory altogether.
Fascinating. Everybody enjoy this? Now, the rest will have 5 minutes for their final comments. Who's going to go first? Okay, sounds fair. 5 minutes, and then we're going to have question and answers. Yeah, good to see you. And you can gather over here and start either now or just take your time. You got about 10 minutes. But form your questions and no monologues, just good questions.
So, this on.
Push the button so the yellow light goes on. There we go. All right, final statements from Dr. Drum.
So I hope we've all learned a lot tonight about what it means to be scientific. There are certain rules, parameters, and methods you must follow in order to be qualified as scientific. And evolution follows all of these. One important point we came across is that science is critical. Peer review is very critical. It weeds out bad science. But what makes evolution such an incredible scientific theory is that it has withstood 150 years of peer-reviewed scientific criticism and passed with flying colors. Not one piece of evidence based on the scientific method has been to adequately refute evolution or prove creationism for that matter. It really is very gradual change we can believe in. I can understand why some people might not like the idea of evolution, if it goes against what your religious beliefs say, for example. But there is so much glory in discovering what science is and how it works. If any of you don't listen to Rush, you should. But if you do, you might know this quote. Again, Casey has stolen my laser pointer. But anyway, in the song The Motion Detector, 1985 Power Windows album, if you don't have it, quite buy it. Illusions are painfully shattered, right where discovery starts. As soon as I heard that lyric, I immediately thought of science. With one small change. I would take out the word painfully then. There is so much joy in real scientific discovery that we do not have illusions anymore. We don't need them because the truth of science is so much more beautiful and incredible than anything you could dream of or have in any ancient religious text. It really is. As Charles Darwin himself said, there is grandeur in this view of life. The idea of evolution tells us that we're all connected to every other organism in the world, everybody in this room, anything you've ever seen that's alive or ever has been alive, you're connected to it. What an incredible idea. What a thrilling idea. How do people, right now, my hairs are standing up on my arm as I say this. It's an amazing concept. And it's even more amazing by the fact that we can check if it's right through the scientific method. And when we do, it trumps everything else. It really is the only show in town. So before we get into the Q&A, there's a lot of people I want to thank. This has been a collaborative effort, and I really want to thank Casey for doing this, everybody who came. I want to thank the Secular Student Alliance here at the University of Nevada, Reno. Please give it up for them. The Reno Freethinkers. A lot of Reno Freethinker members helped me a lot in this presentation, getting all this set up. Thank you all so much. The people on this list, Gana Garari has been irreplaceable in helping with this presentation. Richard Evans from Reno Freethinkers. I want to go through everybody, but I don't have time. But to everyone who's here and everyone who's not, who helped me in any way, thanks very much. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Check your pockets, the laser pointer.
Check it later.
Casey, my clock, as you know, is in heaven. So you are on the honor system. 5 minutes is what you got.
All right. I appreciate all of you coming tonight. I'm, again, overwhelmed by the turnout. We didn't know how many would come. I'm glad the room seats 200, not 150, as we initially thought. Standing room only, that's great. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest in this issue. Again, thank you to the SSA, to Ben. He and I are good friends. I'm sure you can tell that to some degree. We get along really well. We see each other on a weekly basis, just about, and hopefully we'll continue these conversations in the weeks to come. By way of closing, what I keep coming back to is that macroevolution isn't observable. It's not been observed. And the evolutionists across the board that I've heard, be it Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne, you name the evolutionists, they will admit that this isn't observable and can't be observed in our limited lifetime. Like Ben, in terms of how he views my position, I agree. I agree that there are certain things that I can't know that we can't know. I've been very clear about that. And all I'm asking for is the same from Ben and from others. There are things we can know, and there's a lot that we cannot know. And if we're going to assert that macroevolution is a fact, we need to have observable evidence. All Ben can present, I don't fault him for this, is an interpretation of the evidence. Again, the pseudogenes, the junk DNA is an example. An evolutionist sees common descent, a creationist sees common design. We look at vestigial organs, and an evolutionist sees common descent, loss of function. A creationist sees common design, loss of function. We admit that. In the end, what it boils down to is not which is more scientific, but rather which interpretation best fits the data. And as a human being, and I'm, I guess, stepping outside of the scientific bubble for just a second, as I've alluded to already, I think we all look at this world. I think we all see the design and the complexity. We see the genetic code. We see these things, and I conclude that there must be a designer. Even Dawkins and Coyne and others look at the world and says it appears designed. We can't deny that. All I'm asking of you is to reach into yourself and to understand and to acknowledge that that is true, and that maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's something to that. The Bible is where I start. How much time do I have? 2 minutes, 30 seconds? All right.
Wait, that was one of the God guys who's talking.
This clock went off a second ago, so I didn't know. Sorry? Right.
Couple minutes.
Okay,
Wrap it up.
I admit I start with the Bible. I admit that. What I also, and what I would hope Ben and many of you would admit, is that science doesn't answer all of our questions. Science doesn't address everything. I didn't have a chance to bring that up in the cross-examination. But I don't think science answers all of the deeper questions we have. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? And so you may be a scientist, you may be a friend of science, you may be a fan of science. I am. That's great. But understand it doesn't answer all of our questions. Ultimately, we weren't there millions of years ago or 4,000 years ago. All we can do is the best we can to interpret the evidence, and we all have a presupposition. We all have a starting point. And I start with the Bible, I admit that. And sorry, those thoughts are a little bit scattered. But in closing, I hope you can see that there's a lot more to this discussion than maybe you thought. I've got 356 slides addressing all of these issues. If you have any questions, I hope they come up in the Q&A, but there's a lot more to say. We barely scratched the surface. This evening has flown by. So thank you for your attention tonight.
Thank you very much for the slide 356 of their slides. Now, we are going to do questions. Oh, good, we've got a good line here. Sir, you want to come out here? We have a couple of cameras here. So we're going to bring that here, and you can, come on, both of you fellas over here. Yeah, you want to grab a seat and grab the mics and
Yeah, let's do that.
If I can turn this one on.
yeah, we'll use these. They're both hot.
Sit next to each other.
No fighting.
Close, sir. Yeah, sir, right. Now, I'm sure everybody's appendix in the room is fine, but the bladders, that's a whole other thing, I bet. So, we'll run through this. If you have to step out, by all means, go ahead. So, sir, you have a question?
Yeah, great job, guys. Casey, quick question. God created the heavens and the earth, all the animals in the water and the land. Were you there?
No, I wasn't there.
Thank you.
That was an easy one. It's not there. And your question is for?
Ben.
First of all, I have really enjoyed this time. I've learned a lot, and I thank you. Ben, I like to pursue this idea of sexual reproduction just a little bit further. We know that in this world today, everything reproduces. You have to have a male and a female. And whether it be most vegetation, most animals, fish, birds, insects, whatever. And so what came first? Number one, the male or the female?
Do you have something else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do have. Okay.
What came first, the male or the female? The answer is none and both at the same time. Evolution happens on such a gradual scale that there was never a case of, oh, a first female appeared and now we need a first member of the opposite sex. Evolution doesn't work that way. Evolution happens on such a gradual scale that you wouldn't even notice it if you could be. For example, if you look at photographs of yourself every single day you were born, you look exactly the same in every one of those as the one before and the one after. And if you do that every single time, you'll go from a baby to a teenager to middle-aged to old, and you won't even notice it happen. That's how slow evolution is. The idea of a very first male popping into existence, that's the opposite of what evolutionary theory actually teaches.
I understand. 2 more questions.
No.
I'm afraid we only have time for one each.
One question, let's go. Yeah.
Yes, sir, you have a question.
First, thank you both for an excellent debate. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question is for Casey. So in his talk, Ben talked about the falsifiability. I'll try this again.
Give another chance.
So Ben talked about the falsifiability criterion, and the falsifiability criterion, and its importance to the scientific method. So if a theory is unfalsifiable, then it's not scientific. So my question is, what specific observations in the genome or the fossil record or elsewhere would falsify creation?
I actually had a slide on that, and I don't think I can move, but I do think the creation model can be falsified. I don't believe it will be, obviously from the standpoint of faith. But if you were to find true order from unicellular life to complex life, if that could be proven, I think that it would falsify the creation model. I'm sorry?
Paper, I'll show you later.
Okay. Ben's going to help me out on this one at a later date. But I had a ton of slides on the anachronistic fossils. There you go. There are a lot of examples of out-of-place fossils, mammals that are alive today, found in dinosaur strata. I don't think there is order in the fossil record. Maybe someone else can ask the question and we can get into greater detail on that. But from my studies, even though there does appear, from a superficial standpoint, to be this order from unicellular life to complex life, I don't see it. So that would be, you mentioned the fossil record specifically. If there was true order, I think that would present a problem, although I do think a lot of the creation model, the flood does explain that. I had a slide on that too. But I do think the flood does explain some of the order that does exist in the record.
Okay, now the question he has 2, but he says they're just one-word answers, he promised.
Pretty easy. Ben, does evolution answer the question of the origin of life or physical objects? And Casey, where does it say in the Bible that we should read scriptures literally, which would yield an account of creation?
Good. Casey, you want to go first? You want to finish the second one? You want to go for that?
Sure. I think it's a natural interpretation of the Bible. When you read a book, you assume it's literal unless the evidence indicates otherwise. We're told the Bible is the inspired word of God. 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 says that all Scripture is given by the inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be equipped, thoroughly furnished unto every good work. So I think that the Bible itself, your answer is, there you go. I think that the answer is self-explanatory. When you read a book that presents as historical narrative, when you read a book that presents as narrative, as history, then you interpret it as history unless there's some key phrase that says, wait a second, don't interpret this as literal. I know many interpret Genesis in a very symbolic way. I think that's a very unnatural interpretation. I think you have to begin with the assumption that evolution is true, for example. Or you have to begin with the assumption that a flood was local and not universal, that this couldn't have happened. You have to begin with the criticism that this could not be true in order to interpret it as symbolic. I know we're not dealing here with science per se, but that's my answer. I think the natural reading is historical narrative.
Did you need your question repeated?
If I remember correctly, does evolution explain the origin of life?
Or physical objects.
No, that's abiogenesis.
Snappy. All right, next, please, sir. You look very nice.
Hi, this message is brought to you. This question is for Casey. Casey, numerous times during this debate, you've mentioned the word information regarding the genome. And I don't know that your use of the word information is really justified. Are we talking about information, or is this chemistry? Because I think it makes a difference.
Okay.
Separating facts from data. Hearsay.
What I know is what I've read even in scientific literature. It's called the genetic code. It's called the genetic alphabet by scientists. I agree that there's chemistry involved, but this isn't a rock. This isn't something non-material. This is something alive. This is something that can be positioned in a certain way to create a word, an amino acid or a sentence, a protein code. I think that from the scientific perspective, from the scientific literature I've read, it's called language. It's called a code. So the fault might be with the scientists who mislabel it. But as I look at it,
It's not just metaphor. Isn't that just a metaphor? The example of the encyclopedia, isn't that just metaphorical, saying that there is the possibility that the genome is so long that if you transformed it into letters, you could have this similar amount to have the encyclopedia.
right. The genetic code is very similar to our alphabet. And when you ask me the question, what is information, I've got some slides on defining what information is in terms of the individual parts having statistical value in relation to other parts in the word, for example. So if you look at surrender Dorothy in the sky, you understand that the S means this, the U means this, that together they make a word. And if you scramble them, you don't have a word. That's information. It's statistical, it's structured. It has meaning, it has interpretation. With genetic information, with the genetic code, you're looking at nucleotides that comprise amino acids, that comprise protein chains, that if you change the order of the sequence, the word no longer makes sense. So the genetic language has all the bearings of information. If it doesn't, then neither does our language today, which came about by intelligence.
That was a tough one. You want to come on next? Sir?
I'm just starting here.
Question is for Ben. I'm going
Can you
to,
come forward with your mic?
sorry.
Close to the speaker.
My question is for Ben, and I'm going to need some of his help to make my question make sense. First of all, I'm not a scientist. And secondly, I'm a believer in creation. So those are two things that I think you need to know. The help I need from you is, it's been my observation that through time, science has made discoveries that invalidated science previously. For example, quantum mechanics, I think, developed or finally figured out that mass can exist in two places at the same time. I'm not wrong in that. I hope that's a good example. My question then is for you, how is the scientific method the right tool to define this issue of creation versus evolution, and why is it not necessarily right at this point in time, since we figure out that science isn't always right in what it believes until the ability to measure differently or what have you is changed? So why is the basis of this whole discussion the right basis?
That's a great question.
That is fascinating.
Why science is the right thing to investigate the origins or the evolution of life is because the scientific method is, as you've indicated, self-correcting. Science is critical of itself. When a new evidence is presented in accordance with the scientific method, we are forced to change our ideas in light of that new evidence, if it's done scientifically. That's happened, as you've suggested many times throughout history. It's important to remember that even evolution, to a scientist, is not and should never be dogma. Evolution should be open to criticism. and it is open to criticism all the time, same as any other scientific model. But what makes evolution such a great scientific theory is that it has withstood 150 years of those criticisms. Unlike other methods of looking at the world, for example, interpreting a religious text, science is self-correcting. It can be shown to be wrong. And science has been shown to be wrong. That's why scientists have jobs. They get up in the morning to do more science, whereas the interpretations of religious texts, for example, cannot be falsified. They cannot be shown to be wrong. There's no way to improve them. Science is constantly improving. In 400 years, the scientific method has taken us from looking at the moon through a little telescope to having human beings on it. Such is the self-correcting power of criticizing itself to the point of achievement. That is why the scientific method is the only appropriate way to investigate the natural world.
Are you saying science is evolving?
Yes, science is evolving.
So when will it get to the point where we'll be able to actually know that God existed?
The problem is, you can't.
I think it might be your mic, that cable.
Yeah, it's not my
Maybe we
mind.
could just share with you. Share the mic. Why don't you sit on his lap? Snuggle up.
The question of the existence of God is a different debate, but if I can touch on it very briefly, you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that leprechauns don't exist. You can't prove that unicorns don't exist or never have. It's impossible to prove negative, especially scientifically. However, using the scientific method, we can prove or disprove scientific questions. So if we cannot prove or disprove something scientifically, it's not really a valid scientific question. Does that suffice, or do we have time to add on?
No, I do appreciate that. I don't know if you want to weigh in on this.
Well, not really. Just in repeating myself, that I dispute the scientific evidence, which we really, unfortunately, didn't really get into with the pseudogenes, the junk DNA, and the atavisms and the vestigial organs. We didn't really have a whole lot of opportunity to debate some of those alleged evidences. But simply put, I don't agree with the evidence as it's being interpreted by my good friend here and by many others in the scientific community. So I agree with Ben that you can't prove a negative. That's a logical fallacy. I begin with the Bible, and that, again, that's another debate. But on scientific grounds, again, it's a question of which interpretation best fits data. And I'm speaking for myself here, not for anybody else, but for me, creation is the best interpretation.
Thank you both for excellent work. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Hello, Miss.
Casey, I'm wondering, you mentioned, you don't agree with the transitional fossils, but how do you explain that we have mass extinctions throughout history where we don't see a human fossil mixed in with Permian fossils, or the Cambrian? Even if God selectively decided to kill off those organisms, if more advanced humans and things like that were kicking around, they still, at some point, their bones would have found their way into that strata. We do not see that throughout geologic time. We do see mixing sometimes when a slope, sloughs off into the ocean and takes older fossils down into a deeper strata. But that doesn't mean that those organisms were living at the same time. They just moved down into the rock record. So how would you explain that you don't find a human, you don't find a rabbit, you don't find a dinosaur in Permian age rocks?
Well, one of my biggest issues that I've somewhat raised this evening is I don't think that the fossil record. I don't think we can fully know, because even Darwin himself admitted in the 1800s, granted, that we had barely scratched the surface in digging and excavating and in finding these fossils. If you look at the fossil beds, if you look at the locations where archaeologists and paleontologists dig, they're few and far between, that they're not happening all over the place. In other words, what I'm getting at is that our knowledge of the true fossil record is far from complete. In order to assume transitional fossils, you have to assume complete knowledge. And there are a number of examples where later research, later digs have falsified previously made statements or conclusions about the fossil record. One other thought I had is in regards to the coelacanth. They thought it was extinct. I think, 65 million years ago, that they believed that it went extinct because they didn't find it in any rock rock strata above that.
Coelacanth is a fish. by the way.
Yes, sorry. But they found living coelacanths today. Does that mean that for those 80 million years there were no coelacanths? Obviously not. My point being that just because you don't find fossils in a given strata doesn't mean that they weren't alive or not alive at that time. So again, just to bring this back to my initial point, we don't have complete knowledge of the fossil record. And there are many examples where later discoveries have overturned previously held theories and anachronistic fossils and out-of-place fossils and so on.
Yeah, good answer. We got to keep this moving because it is a long thing. He's coming around for a second turn. Yeah, let's go over here. I keep drifting that way towards you guys.
Good evening. I'm probably the dimmest light bulb in this room, so I'm going to ask a different sort of approach for Dr. Drum. And what we're doing here and the motivation and the impetus for what it is that we've been asking these questions is origin. You know, and Casey hit on it earlier a little bit. Who are we? Where did we come from? The ones that he didn't ask, that I will ask, is what is the meaning, and is there meaning and purpose to life? And then what happens to us when we die? That's the reason we're doing any of this. And so for you, Dr. Drum, and I'm not going to ask you personally, sir, because you've already given your bio, but what are the prevailing theories? And do those prevailing theories give us any comfort other than the fact that we can stand in science and say it's right? To what is the meaning and purpose of life, and what happens when we die? Because that's why we're asking these questions.
Well, it's difficult to scientifically answer the meaning of life, but give it a shot.
Well, I was pondering this in the bath last Tuesday.
He only takes a bath on Tuesdays.
Every other. If I could slightly rephrase the question to the context of tonight's debate, what does evolution tell us about the meaning of life? What does evolution tell us about what happens after we die? The short answer is absolutely nothing. Evolution is a scientific theory which explains the common ancestry and biodiversity of life on Earth. Evolution is not a code of ethics. It is not a treaty on how human beings should treat one another. It is not a set of morality that scientists and evolutionists should follow. Anybody who interprets it that way is intrinsically wrong. That is what evolution means. Evolution is a scientific theory which explains scientific observations. You could ask another evolutionist sitting beside me what the meaning of life is, and he could give you a totally different answer. The question should be, what does evolution tell us about the meaning of life? Absolutely nothing, nor should it. That's a philosophical question. It is not a scientific question. What does it tell us about what happens after we die? Absolutely nothing. It doesn't claim to, nor should it. Evolution only claims to tell us about how we have evolved over time from common ancestors. Anything after we die, again, could that be scientific? Possible. But we haven't had a good way of investigating that scientifically. So if you're asking, what does evolution tell us about the meaning of life? Nothing. Should it? I don't think it should.
Fascinating answer. And by the way, my meaning of life is waiting at home. So we got about 8 more minutes and we're going to wrap it up. We'll try to get a few more questions in. So please, sir.
I have a question for Casey, and I would really appreciate it if Ben would comment on it just a bit. My question is that since the proof of anything to be scientific is true, to verify that prediction would become true, then my question to you is, what natural event or natural phenomenon has creationism predicted that evolution, the theory of evolution, has not predicted, and it turned out to be true? Thank you.
Great question.
What predictions you're asking me what predictions are made from the creation model about natural phenomena?
That were not predicted by science. That's what I got. By the evolution theory.
Right. Okay. It's not exactly a fair question. The Bible's been around a lot more, and religion's been around a lot longer than modern day scientists. But there are scientific statements made in the Bible. I'm not as confident on some of them. I think that it can be a matter of interpretation in certain instances. But regarding the water cycle, Earth's placement in space, regarding reproducing after one's kind, which again is all we observe today. There are a number of purpose, vestigiality. The evolutionary model predicts that organs are vestigial, that they can be vestigial. They predict this, they cut organs out that, as it turns out, later have function. The Bible would say that there is function, that there is design. So, I mean, I guess we could go down a laundry list of predictions made in the Bible, statements made in the Bible, even though it's not primarily a scientific book. There are scientific statements made, observations made about the natural world that have borne out to be true. And I think that, again, in regards to vestigiality, that creationism would have predicted that a lot more accurately than evolution has. If I can, and you wanted Ben to add to this as well? I don't know.
Okay, I just need 30 seconds. If the Bible does make a lot of scientific predictions and observation, for example, that bats are birds, and such as the like, which we know is not scientifically true. It makes lots of other predictions as well, which are true. But none of them are unique to the Bible. If you look at any ancient text written around the same time, anything that the Bible actually got right about science was already widely known in the ancient world, which you can find in the Quran and various other Hindu and Buddhist texts. But what specific, testable, predictable predictions has creationism ever made that have been subsequently scientifically verified? I can't think of a single one off the top of my head. Maybe we can talk about it after and you can tell me, show me the journal. I can't think of any.
They both answered your question. Just a couple more. Try to get through everybody.
My question is for Dr. Drummond. You made an analogy of the theory of evolution to the theory of gravity. It's like it's easy simply to say an apple falling as observable evidence for gravity. What would you? I think not that easy is to the theory of evolution. So what would you say the best, simpler observable evidence for the theory of evolution that anyone could say, oh, this is easy to see, that is observable evidence for evolution?
If I could think of one very specific example, if in the University of Rochester there's an evolutionary group there that study E. coli, and they've actually, E. coli eat a certain type of sugar called lactose, and scientists have taken out the lactose breakdown genes in E. coli. They don't have them at all. They can't eat E. coli. Oh, sorry, they can't eat lactose. And then they put these bacteria in a lactose-only environment. And what would you expect would happen? They should all die. And sure, they do start to die off. But they predicted that if the beneficial mutation occurred in the E. coli genome to allow for lactose breakdown, they would be naturally selected to survive. That's exactly what they found. Beneficial mutation happened after the gene was deleted. It wasn't there. And that mutation occurred, allowed for lactose breakdown, and the E. coli could survive. Not only that, that mutation was subsequently followed by a second and a third, subsequent generations later. What are we seeing here? Addition of novel genetic information leading to a complex biochemical breakdown pathway, which according to the creationism model we've heard a lot of tonight, has never been observed. It's all there. People just have to understand the science, pick up the paper and read it.
What was the time lapse of that? Real time from?
About 10 days.
Wow.
If I'm thinking of
that was very interesting. Sorry.
If I'm thinking of the right experiment, that took place for what, 10, 15 years? Wasn't it measured over?
Thinking of the Linsky experiment at the University of Michigan. That's a different.
Okay. I don't guess I'm in a position to ask questions, so I'll make an observation. I'll phrase it as a question. It's rhetorical, I suppose.
This isn't Jeopardy.
Okay. My question would be: are these examples where mutations lengthen the genome and increase the complexity of the bacteria, or are these examples, as I mentioned before, where a mutation does occur, which I don't deny, mutations do happen, obviously, where there's a temporary benefit given, even though it may be deleterious in other ways? So new information can be added, or information can be added, but is it a loss of functionality that results in a temporary advantage wherein the genome isn't lengthened, is my question. So mutations may occur, and there may be advantageous traits, but number one, is it a lengthening of the genome? And number two, does it change from anything than bacteria? Does it change into?
Real quick, yeah, just real quick.
Sorry.
In that particular example, no, but we have seen in other experiments or examples in plants where we do see a lengthening of the genome. There's a process known as polyploidy, whole genome duplication, where the entire genome of a plant can duplicate itself and double. And there's also transcriptional enzyme domestication, which is pretty much the same thing in eukaryotes.
Usually when we think of evolution, we're thinking of living organisms. My question, though, would be, from a scientific standpoint, looking at evolution, how did matter come into existence from nothing? Was it beginning with inanimate matter, or animate matter, or both? How did one get, yes, Dr. John, how did one derive from the other? And if we can't explain that, aren't we just trying to assimilate the facts of a miracle?
You, sir, are asking a question which should be asked to a physicist, not a biologist. How did we
Give it a shot.
Well, from what I do know, which is very little, modern physics is actually doing a really good job of showing how something comes from nothing. You should read the Lawrence Krauss book, A Universe from Nothing. He goes into it in great detail. So do we know how matter came into existence initially? No, and evolution doesn't even claim, doesn't even begin to try to say that, oh, well, we know how matter comes into existence. As with the meaning of life question we came across earlier, evolution is a biological, scientific theory which explains how life changed on Earth over time. That's all it does. It doesn't claim to say anything else about other realms of science. So if you're asking me personally, I don't know. But if you're willing to look up the scientific work of physicists, for example, perhaps they can give you more information.
Or talk to him.
Not that guy.
You know, just to be fair, there were parameters that we established, or we tried to. It's hard to stay within those when we're asking questions like the meaning of life. And I don't know if we can equip to provide those answers, but I think we have time for one more question. And a lovely lady she is who's going to ask.
All right, this question is for Dr. Drum, and I guess it's kind of more of an open-ended question or something, but I was thinking about a couple of points that Casey made a while back. One of them is the notion that science is but one of many explanations for how the world works, and everything that science doesn't cover can be filled in by faith. And then the other point that was addressed was that the Bible predates the modern notion of science, and that seems to kind of further support that theory that there could be many ways of explaining how the world works besides science. And I think that if we're asking the question of is evolution or creationism better explained by science, then there would be no doubt that it, of course, is evolution. But I'm just curious about your responses to that and to that notion.
It's a valid point. It could be entirely possible that creationism is true. I'm not denying that. It's entirely possible that right now the world is sitting on the back of a giant turtle. But scientifically, we cannot disprove or disprove that, can we? So when we're trying to derive anything meaningful about the natural world, the only thing we can revert to is science. Because it's the only self-correcting method we have that we know is critical of itself and works. I'm a fan of speculation. I love sitting back and coming up with all kinds of crazy ideas about how the world works and what this could be. But in order to check those critically and test them, science is the only natural method we have for doing that. There may be other methods, supernatural, but we can't call them science.
And actually, that seems to me that you're trying to justify this using the laws of science. That's kind of the problem I see with that.
The scientist's brain.
I guess.
What can I say?
Thank you. Great question. We have one last one. Oh, I'm sorry, two. Yeah, we're right on time.
Thanks, appreciate it. The question as to how kangaroos arrived in Australia doesn't really keep me awake at night, but you both brought it up to illustrate a point. So my question is for Dr. Drum. In light of the fact that we have invasive species, say in Lake Tahoe, mussels, pike, warm water bass, they're simply transported there. Is it implausible to think that at a later time, much later, after the Ark had landed on Mount Ararat, that they were simply transported on a man-made vessel with a seafaring man and his marsupial-loving crew?
Is it plausible? Well, let me put it this way.
Is it possible?
Is it possible? Yes. Is it scientific? Not at all. The reason it's not scientific is, well, let's try to make predictions about it. Let's test it. Can we? How can we? I don't think we can. Or we can test the evolutionary idea of fossils in Antarctica, and when we do those predictions and do the experiment, do the digging, we find them. How can we test if Noah's Ark landed on Turkey and he was somehow able to find somebody who was able to build a vessel that could hold kangaroos for hundreds of days, but let's not kid ourselves, they didn't have American Airlines back then, to get all the way from Turkey to Australia? How can we test that? What can we predict from it? This is the difference between what's plausible in our minds and what's scientific in the real world. Is it possible? Sure. It's absolutely possible. But can we test it and say it's scientific? Absolutely not.
Interesting question, though. Interesting choice of animals, because the hopping ability of the kangaroo also makes it a little bit murky as well. Thank you, sir.
Can I add something?
Please, yeah. This will be the last question.
Okay, I think this gets into history. How much of history can be tested, repeated, observed? Not much. We depend upon documents, we depend upon inferences, reports from that time and that era. That may not be scientific, but it's valid. When we talk about Lincoln or Caesar, or we talk about these various historical events, are we using science or are we using history? Does history invalidate science or vice versa? So I don't know that because it can't be falsified that it didn't happen, which you're not necessarily saying. But what I'm simply suggesting is that history may be an alternative explanation, and I think the question's valid. If it's possible historically, then I don't know that we can make a scientific statement necessarily against it.
Well, he did say you can't prove a negative also, so, but it's more fascinating.
Which
question.
again, I don't know, and I don't think we can.
Please.
I go to Casey's church, and anybody, if you didn't have the opportunity to attend Casey's evidence classes, most of this information goes into detail and is on the website of the church, which is Queenway COC. So I'm not trying to advertise, I'm just saying if you want more detail, and you didn't get time to ask a question. But Casey made me think about that science is man's feeble way of studying what God did. And what my question is to Dr. Drum, I would like to know, if we did all evolve from us humans, evolve from apes, then why are apes still here, and why can't apes talk?
I think she said that science is man's feeble attempt to explain God's word first.
It's a huge misconception, which is very common, that humans evolved from modern apes. A similar way to ask a very similar question would be, if Americans descended from Europeans, why are Europeans still around? Think about it like that.
That's a good one.
We did not evolve from modern apes. All our cousins in the evolutionary tree, modern chimpanzees, bonobos, we descended from a common ape-like ancestor, which is now extinct. We did not evolve from the apes that we see in the world today.
But we have the intelligence and the reasoning ability, and no other species got that.
Well, intelligence is a relative thing. If you look at other primates, they are incredibly intelligent in relation to, say, mollusks or bacteria. We know that primates have very primitive vocalizations, as do dolphins, other types of mammals, whales. Now, why is it that we evolved it and not another? Human intelligence is very costly. Evolution is also about trade-offs. What is beneficial for one organism may not be beneficial for another. It has proven that evolution has shown us that human intelligence has been very beneficial for our species. It could be just simply a case that modern apes are simply better off without it. The resources and biological time and energy that go into intelligence could perhaps be better spent in stronger limbs. Who knows? We're not entirely sure of that. But evolution is a trade-off. There is no reason to think that just because humans are intelligent, that negates evolution. It doesn't at all.
But you never mentioned weather. And all of
Weather?
every single organism on this planet, no matter how old it is exposed, actively exposed to sustainable environment, and we can't even predict the weather now. And there's obviously earthquakes and things that have altered the shape of the Earth and what happens to every peninsula. So therefore, it would make sense that weather could move things around.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's getting a little enormous, and I think it's probably time to end the.
We can talk afterwards.
Yeah, please stick around. Very good question. Everybody, thanks very much. What do you think of these two new guys? Well done, Jim. I hope that everybody knows this is my overtime. And I hope you laugh a little bit light in one way or the other and enjoy it. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the SSA. Thanks to the university, and thanks to your church. Thanks, everybody.